For a long time, knowing Notion formulas and Notion automations was more of a nice to have. But with the most recent updates, this has definitely changed. If you want to use Notion fully in 2025, you need to understand them. Want to show the next task in line? Automatically close to-dos when a project is done? Or build whole games in Notion? Well, whatever it is. In this video, we will go over everything you need to know, from basic concepts all the way to my favorite use cases. And don't worry, even if you've never worked with formulas before and didn't quite like math in school, this is different. In fact, I'm willing to bet that if you like Notion, you will love using formulas and automations. Just promise me that you go through the full tutorial so that you don't miss a thing. Sounds good? Well, then let's dive in and start with formulas. To start, we're going to write our first formula right away, and then we look at the theory and the structure behind it in a moment. So here we have a simple database, we have products, we have costs, and we have the amount. Now, how do we get the total for it, right? Well, in order to write any formula, we always need to add a property Notion. So we click on plus, search for the formula property, and now we have it here, and we can just call this sum, like any other Notion property. In order to write the formula, we click either on edit formula here, or if we're outside, we can also just click inside one of these empty properties here, and that also opens Notion formula editor. Now we're going to talk about the editor in a bit more in a moment. But basically, up here is where you write your formula. Here you get a little preview area, and down here you see all the operators, all the things that you can do with Notion formulas, plus a preview, sort of like a helper style article about them. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to take the amount property and we want to multiply it with the number property at a cost. And as you can see down here, it tells me that these are the properties available on the database. We have the name, we have cost, we have amount, and then we have a bunch of properties that we actually haven't added actively to this database, but which are always created by the system, right? Create by, created time, edited by, and edited time. So even if you didn't add them to, you can use them. And you will always see the properties that you have in your Notion database here at the very top before you then see some of the operators that you can use in them. So in order to add them to our formula, we can either just click on them, right? So I can say, well, I want cost, or alternatively, if we remove this, I can also start typing cost, right? And then I can confirm hitting enter now that there's only one entry left. I need to confirm with enter though, because like even if I just write cost, right, it tells me cost is not defined, right? So the word cost is not an operator or not a variable. So we need to make sure that we click on it. And then a property is always represented by this little gray area around it. Plus we see that this is a number, and this will become relevant in a moment. So now if we just had cost, right, and we save it, well, we just show again like the same entry that we have in cost. And we could, of course, since it's a number output, now click on this, say edit property. And now that we have a number as the result of this formula, it tells us also, well, we can format this number, right? We can say this is dollars as well. So now, right, we just copy whatever is here in the front one. That's, of course, not what we're going to do. We're going to multiply it. So in order to do so, what we can do for simple math, we could simply type the multiply sign and then take the amount now afterwards. So and again, we click either on amount or I start typing amount and hit enter. And now we have cost times amount, and I can click on save, right? We get our little preview here. And we see now, okay, for the apples, we would pay $8.40, and for our Notion mugs, we would pay to $10. Rather than using the shortcut for multiply, right, so this multiply sign, we can also just type multiply, right? So similar to Excel, you could say multiply, right? And now what you see in the Notion formula editor is that it tells you here, this is our function, the multiply function, and this is how the multiply function works. Multiply takes two numbers, right? And then it will multiply them with each other. So in order to multiply it to do 5 times 10, right, we type multiply 5, and 10. So that's similar, right, to how you write formulas in Excel, or actually how you write formulas in JavaScript, which is sort of like the underlying methodology for Notion formulas. So let's pick multiply, and now say in brackets, okay, we want first the cost, and then we want comma, then the amount. And this exactly gives us the same result as previously. Now, as you get better with Notion formulas, you will start using these functions more and more rather than just a normal math expression. So it's worth taking a few moments to just learn a bit more about them. If you've never programmed before, then one thing that's important to know is that these things that go inside a function are called arguments, right? So we have a function, it does something, and what does it do? Well, we need to give it certain arguments. This is always what it tells us here, right? This takes 2 arguments, and both of them are numbers. Now, the second thing to know about these functions is that we have actually 2 ways to write it, right? We can use them like this, where we write them similar to how we write in Excel, right? We have our function, then we open our brackets, and then we put both elements inside it. But Notion supports also a second way to write this, and this is the much more powerful and much better way to do so. So we should start doing it from the beginning. And this one is the dot notation. Now, let me show you how that works. for dot notation, we actually start always with a value. So in this case, let's start with cost. But now, rather than doing multiply, we use now, the math expression, we use multiply. In order to do so, right, currently it tells us no result, nothing happens here, but the second I type a dot, you see that now I get a bunch of functions here. Basically, Notion recognizes that if I type a dot, I want to do something to the cost element. And now it's going to show me all the functions that I can use connected to cost. We'll dive a bit deeper into the different functions where you can use them later. But for now, just know that whenever you have any property, you type dot, you see all the things that you could do with it right here, and you could scroll down to figure out what it is. We know already what we want, right? We want to do multiply. So if I start typing multiply, it will start selecting it. Now I can click on it. And now what you see is, again, I can put something inside it. But this time, since we already know cost is this thing that we want to multiply, we only put amount in it. So the result is the same, right? We get $8.40 and $10. But now, instead of writing both arguments inside of multiply, we written cost, and then we want to multiply it with the amount. On a technical basis, what happens is whenever we use the dot annotation, Notion knows that the first argument for the function should be the one before it, right? So in other words, right, if we could actually also type, like 2, right, as a number, and then we know, okay, we want to multiply 2 with the amount. So that's how this works. The element before the dot takes one of the argument slots. And that's important because what you see now, if I say like, okay, I want to have 2 and then I want to multiply it with the amount and the cost. If I now try to multiply 2 arguments, right, so if I do dot and cost just like before, now we get an error, right? We say function multiply received unexpected argument. It only expects one number now, since the first one is already in there, and it doesn't have slots for more, right? Multiply will always only take 2 numbers, not more, right? So if I also were to write multiply, and then, like 5, 2, and 3, well, it tells me this doesn't work, right? We can only take 2 arguments at the same time. But why go through the trouble of learning dot notation, right? It seems like fairly complicated for something where I could simply type 5 times 2, right? It would be much, much easier. Well, in a simple situation like this, yes. But for the more complex formulas later, we really need dot notation. And that's because dot notation allows us to read a formula from left to right and understand what it does. And with brackets, that's often not the case. So if you've ever written more complex Excel formulas, you know how annoying it is to try to figure out where your brackets all have to close. So let's take our example from before, right? Let's say we want to have, we want to multiply the cost and the amount. And now we want to round that value. Well, how do we round? Well, let's just take this out for a moment, right? There's a round operator. So if I just type round, we see, okay, there's a function round. It takes value and then precision if we want to, right? So it gets us the number and it returns it to the nearest integer, so the nearest full number. Which means, right, if I type round and then 1.3, the result is 1, as expected. So how would we do it in Excel or with the, the bracket notation? Well, we type round, and then in brackets for round, we now type multiply, and then in multiply, we take cost and we take the amount. So, right, multiply, cost, amount, and then round the whole thing, which is fine if we leave it like this, right? This we can still recognize where the brackets open, and we can sort of figure out if we had math in school that we first multiply and then round. But now imagine you need to do 7 or 8 operations, right? And then you need to figure out, okay, where are your brackets, in what order are things, triggered? Really, really complicated. But with dot notation, all we do is, well, we take costs, that's our starting value. Then we want to multiply cost with the amount. So far, so good. And then we want to take that result, right, the result of that multiplication, and we want to round it. So we can read now left to right, cost, multiplied with amount, and then round it. Much easier to understand. That's pretty much it for the very first thing we need to know about Notion formulas, right? We write them by going into a property, we click into it, we can then write things either with normal math operators, if they are available. We can use the functions, and the functions we can use either with the bracket version or with this dot annotation. One last thing to know about the Notion formula editor is that you also can move things on new lines. And again, with a short formula like this, it's not very relevant, but with longer formulas later, it will be very helpful to break things up. To do so, you can simply go in and type Shift-Enter. And this will move things on a new line. And again, this just makes it in very long expressions easier to understand it, what happens, right? So instead of reading left to right, you can now see, okay, we have cost, we multiply this with amount, and then we round the whole thing, just to break it up a bit visually. Now, before we move on, there's one last very important thing about Notion and formulas that you need to understand. And that is that Notion is not a spreadsheet. Databases, if you start using them in the beginning, they look a lot like spreadsheets, right? That's what we're most familiar with. They look like Excel, right? We have our little things here on the side. We have columns, we have rows, and we have entries. But it's very different conceptually a spreadsheet from a database. And for you as a normal user, right, the most important distinction is that when you do math in Notion, you can only do math on the entry, not on specific cells. What do I mean with that? Well, in Excel or in any spreadsheet tool, you kind of have coordinates, right? You can reference any cell in a spreadsheet freely by the two coordinates, right? By the number of the row and by the letter of the column. Which means if I have, number 3 here in the third row and then the number 4 in this row, I can do math on that, right? I can say, well, I take B3 plus C4, no problem. In Notion, since it's a database, that doesn't work. Your formula will always reference only properties from the same row. Very important, right? So in a database, you think not in coordinates, but you think in properties, and you can only say, well, I want to take the cost of the entry that I look at, and I want to multiply it by the amount of the entry that I look at. Now, there are workarounds where you can sort of fake spreadsheet functionality in Notion, and we're going to talk about this later in this video. But for now, that's just very important to keep in mind, right? One of the limitations or core structural concepts of a database is that your math only happens within one row. Next, we need to talk about data types. Now, data types is not the most interesting topic, but it is super, super important to master in order to ever understand Notion formulas. If you don't know data types, this will hold you back forever. So let's take just a few minutes to very simply understand data types. We don't need to go, into computer science too much, but we just need to be aware sort of what we have. Notion has 5 data types. We have numbers, strings, booleans, dates, and arrays. Arrays are not here yet. We'll talk about them in a second because they're the most complicated one. Numbers, on the other hand, are the simplest data type by far, right? It's what we learn in school. It's basically anything you can do normal math on. So it is, your amounts, your costs. Whenever you add a number property to Notion, well, it is the data type number. You can also recognize the data type whenever you're in a Notion formula, because if it's a number and you reference a property, Notion will give you this handy sign here in the front that always indicates that cost is a number. And on numbers, we can do math, right? That's the most important thing about a number. We can use all our normal math operators on a number. One other indicator of it being a number, is that Notion aligns the value of the cell to the right. You might have not noticed it yet, but anything else in Notion is always aligned to the left of a cell. But numbers, they are aligned to the right. So if I type the number 5 in here, it aligns to the right. If I type the number 5 into this string property, on the other hand, it will align it to the left. Speaking of strings, what are strings? Well, strings are basically any collection of characters, right? And that could be both normal letters, but it can also be numbers if we treat them as, the sort of like the text expression rather than the mathematical value that they represent. So, right, if I type just 5 in here, that's okay. But if I say, 5 apples are needed, right, that is a typical string. Now, we can also use formulas on strings, but the things that we can do with a string is different than, the things that we can do with a number. And let me show you one very good example. Let's take our property here and let's actually go back to 5. And then let's add another string property, right? Let's add another text one here. And let's call this also, let's call this, amount, even though amount 2 I need to call it, or let's call this amount string. And we have, here our string, and we have here our string, let's say 3. If I now try to do math on this, right, I can go into my formula, and I can say, well, okay, please give me the string, right? And then multiply the 5 with the amount from the string. And we get here an error, right? Cannot do math on text and text. And we see also that here we have the text symbol now, not number symbol. We can't do math on these. So that's one important thing. So you would need to turn it into a number property first. But as I mentioned, right, there are operators that we can use on strings. Funnily enough, plus is one of them. But if we use plus on strings, we don't sum the strings, we just squish them together. So 5 plus 3, if they're strings, the result is 53, not 8. Now, if you ever wonder what you can actually do with strings, well, then here's where Notion's formula editor comes in very handy. If I just have my string here, and I now type the dot for the dot notation, I get all the operators, right, and all the functions that I can use with strings. One of the most useful things that I can do with strings, right, is I can count the length, like how many letters are in that, right? In this case, it is 1, and it's currently still set to $, right? So let's actually change this, right? Let's say this is not our normal number, and we don't call this number, but we just call this formula. Perfect. And then let's go here, right? Let's move this over to where our string sits. And let's just start typing a word, this is a sentence. How many characters does it have? And you see my formula keeps ticking up because I keep adding more and more letters to it and count the length. So I see 52 characters for this string. That's pretty much all we need to know about strings at this point. So we can move on to Booleans. Booleans are a fun thing. Booleans are true or false. So right, they have the basic building blocks of computer science, zeros and ones. In Notion, a Boolean is always represented by a checkbox. So if you add a checkbox property, right, this Boolean is just a checkbox property. If you add that to Notion, if it's not checked, it's false. If it is checked, it's true. And if in your formula, right, you can reference a Boolean. So I can go to our Boolean and I can click on it and I see, right, I would just copy it and if I type again on dot, right, I get all my operators that I can use with this Boolean. One other thing to know is that in Notion, if you write a formula that results to true or false, well, it will always give you a checkbox. The easiest way to write something that equates to true or false is to just type true, literally true. Right? If I type that in, I see, okay, I get now for everything in here a checkbox. One very important thing that you might have noticed is that true is actually here highlighted in pink. And that's because it's a special thing, right? It is this Boolean operator. It's very different from any other word, right? If I type, amount in Notion, well, it will tell me, or a monode. Well, a monode is not defined, right? But true is defined. If you want not true Boolean, but the string true, you actually need to put it in quotation marks. So you need to type true. And now you see it's green. This is actually an important thing that I should have mentioned one step earlier with strings. And that is, if you want to reference a string in Notion in a formula and you don't have it in a property, you always need to put it in quotation marks. So, amount can go into our formula, amount. If I put it in quotation marks, right, now it's fine. Now it will just output this here. And if I say amount, right, plus our string, you know what happens. It will just squish the whole thing together. And just as a quick addition, right, for numbers, we don't need to do this, right? For number, we can just type in directly into Notion, similar to, true. It highlights it to me in pink, right, which tells me this is like directly accessible. This is defined. It knows what for is. If I want for the string, not for the number, I need to put it in quotation marks and it turns green. Last but not least, what are other ways to get true or false in an expression? Well, whenever you use a comparison. So whenever I say, well, is 3 equal to 4? Well, no, it's false, right? That's why it gives me here as a formula the unchecked checkbox. But if I ask, for example, is amount equal to 7? Well, then in this case, it gives me a checkbox because here it's true, but here amount is 2, so it gives me false. One thing you might have noticed is I type 2 equal signs. And that's a specialty, again, that you need to know about Notion. If you want to compare something, you want to say it is equal to, you need to type 2 equal signs. And that's because you also have other options, right? So, of course, we can also compare whether something is bigger than, right? Or whether something is smaller than something, and the other way around, right? And just set this wrong. And we can check things here. And now this resolves false for both of them because, well, the amount 7 is not bigger than 7. But we can now add an equal sign to this and say, well, bigger than or equal. In this case, of course, now it will be checked because 7 is the same as the amount. Last but not least, we can also do not even, and for that we type exclamation mark and equal. And again, that way we check whether something is not the value that we compare to. All right, last simple data type, and that's dates. Date properties in Notion, right? Whenever you create them anywhere, we can input something, and this is treated again differently in our formulas. So if you have a date here, and we go to our formula, and I reference date, we see, well, if I click into it again, it tells me with the calendar that this is a date property. And if I type dot, I see now all the operators, right, as usual, that I can use for dates. And dates has a range of very, very specific operators that are only available on a date. For example, I can get the minute, hour, and day of a date, right? I can get add things to date. So if you want to do math on dates, right, if you want to add 5 days, you can't just say, well, date, plus 5. That actually, in this case, it does work. So Notion added that. That's good to know. But if I just have 2 dates together and say, okay, let's have another date property here, date 1, yeah, sure. We have January 14th and we have, January 28th. And I want to get the difference between them. I can't say, well, give me date minus date 1. It will tell me here that I cannot do math on date and date. But there are operators, and we'll talk about them later in more detail. But just to give you a quick sneak peek, we would say date between. This gives us the difference between 2 dates, right? It tells us here, returns the difference between 2 dates. Perfect. And we see the arguments that we need is we need the first date, we need the second date, and then we need the unit. Since we use dot notations, you already know that's the first date. So I just type here date 1. And now what is it what I care about? Well, in quotation marks now here, I give it a string argument, right? So I'll give it a string argument and we'll tell it, well, what I want here, the difference is days. So 14 days between these two dates. That was a lot, in particular with the different arguments, right? You don't need to fully understand it yet for now. Just remember, dates are their own property type in Notion, and they have a bunch of operators that only work on dates, so we can't use the general operators for them. Now, let's talk about the last data type that we need to know about, and which is the array. Now, Notion internally for the documentation calls it mostly lists, but we call it array because it's the more generic term in computer science. Basically, you can think of arrays as containers. Containers with slots for all the other data types, right? So you can have an array of strings, you can have an array of numbers, you can have an array of dates, and you can have an array of Booleans. It's just a collection of them. And the beautiful thing about an array, right, is you can imagine it like a box with one slot for the first spot, right, another slot in the second spot, a third slot, and so on and so on. And it can be infinitely long, right? So no matter how many units you need to organize, you can put them all in an array. The cool thing about arrays is that they have then numbers for these different slots, right? So if you put, for example, a certain string into the first slot, well, you can reference it later by saying, well, please get me the entry from the first slot. So it's not just like an unordered list where you don't know where something is, but it is a very organized box and makes it very easy to organize large amounts of data and then, pick a specific element. A lot of this will sound very abstract now when we talk about it in theory, but it will become very clear and also why it's so helpful to know about them once we look at the example in Notion. But just one last thing before we do that, and that is that the order of the array is not necessarily fixed, right? It will put it in an initial order, but you can reorder it based on what you need. For example, if you put a certain element in the first slot, right, and you want to later now reorganize it alphabetically, well, you can do that. And then you can reference the first alphabetic slot or the second alphabetic slot, which again will come very handy. So how does it translate to Notion? Well, the most common array that you will interact in Notion with is the relation. So if you create a relation between two databases or between one database and connect properties or entries to each other, you're actually creating an array. So here I have on my city, right, I have my 4 contacts here, and these 4 elements are an array. I'll notice this if I go here in the formula, right, and I say edit formula, please give me the contact property. And tells me that it is a relation type, but it tells you here, right, that it is a list, aka an array. As with all the other unique data types in Notion, this means we have a new list of operators. So if I type dot again, right, I see all the operators that work with an array or a list. One of the most important ones in this case, what that at least helps us demonstrate what arrays are, is the add operator. Right? If I look at add, what it does, it gives it a list, and I tell it an index, and it will return that element from the list. So if you look at it, right, we have currently Matthias and Laura and John. If I want a second value from it, well, I can type add and then open close brackets. And of course, right, as you know, list is already the first argument, thanks to the dot notation. So I only need to give it now the number, which I want to retrieve. And if I want to retrieve the second value, I actually need to type in 1. Now, this is a bit weird, but it makes sense in a moment because the way arrays are numbered is that typically the first element in an array is 0. So if we were to count this, right, Matthias is 0, Anne is 1, Laura is 2, and John is 4. So if I want to get John, right, I type 3, and now I retrieve John from this array. Now let's demonstrate a few more things around arrays. First off, right, I was mentioning that we can sort these arrays. So in order to do so, we can the default order is determined by the time at which I linked it, right? I first link Matthias and Anne, then Laura, then John. But if I now go in here and want to say, well, I want to have this ordered alphabetically, I can type dot sort. Sort is a really useful function. We'll use it a ton later. We can also tell it by what we want to sort it, but by default, it will sort it alphabetically. And now we see, well, Anne, John, Laura, and Matthias. So now, if I want to get, the first, if I look at my contacts, right, I'm curious, okay, well, which one is the person that, is at the top of the alphabet, right? I type in dot add and 0. And now, no matter like which ones I link there, I will always get the connected element that is, the first one in the alphabet. So if I add now, like Ni, right, something like this, and I connect her to Berlin, well, my array automatically will resort and will tell me, well, Ani is now the first one in this array. That's pretty much it, what we need to know about them for now. There's just one last thing that is very, very useful when it comes to array, and that is an operator we've already seen before, and that is length. Now, length, when we use it on a string, gives us the characters, right? But if we use it on an array, it will actually give us the number of entries in the array, which is very handy. So here it tells me, well, I have 5 contacts connected. And we will use this all the time with formulas later, particularly in our examples. So for example, right, if you don't have cities and contacts here, but you have projects and tasks, you can count how many tasks you have connected to this project. And we can use other operators on our array to, for example, filter out all the done tasks and only show us open tasks, or we can find the only or like the next open task based on a due date and just show this. So there are a bunch of powerful things that we can do with arrays. So we definitely need to use them later. But for now, this is all we need to know. It's a data type. It's the most complex one, and it's basically one that groups a lot of other data types together. We're going to wrap up this chapter on data types by learning that we can move things between data types, right? Just because something is a number doesn't mean it has to stay a number for our calculation. Or just because it's a string doesn't mean it has to stay a string. Now, the simplest example is if for whatever reason, right, we say here, okay, we have 5 and we have apples in our account. This is our text, right, and this is our number. Now, we can't do, like math on this, right? We can say this plus this. But if we now just try in our formula, right, I think this was our formula. Yes, perfect, let's go in here. If we say, well, give me what was it? It was a number. Give me number plus string. Well, you see, the result is 5 apples in our account. So Notion by default, if there's a number and we do, like this plus with a string, it will turn the number into a string. It squishes things together because there's actually no space. So, right, if I either type a space in here, it looks correct, or if I add a space to my expression, it will look correct. So in order to do so, we type plus and then we type quotation mark, right? Because in order to create a string, we always type quotation marks. And then inside that string, and that quotation marks, I just put one empty space. And then I type another plus, right? And now we get 5 apples in our account. Perfect. Another way to turn a number into a string is to simply use the format option, right? So if I have my number and I type dot format, we see that dot format returns the value formatted as text. So now my 5 is left aligned, right? It's no longer a number that is right aligned. It is a string that is left aligned. Same works, by the way, for arrays, right? So if I take my contacts and I say dot format, well, now it just returns all the names with commas, right? But it is now a string. So if I call length on this, it now gives me the characters, not the number of entries in here. This also works the other way around, right? So if we have, again, our number, right? So we do a format to turn it into a string, or we can turn it back into a number. So we can say, in this case, to number, and now it is again a 5 that is aligned on the right. We can also do this on other strings, so we can use this in general. To number helps us to pass a number from a text. But of course, a number needs to be present. So if we take our string, right, which is apples in our account, and try to number, well, it just doesn't give me anything because there's no number in here. But the second I have any number in here, right, so for example 78, it actually, in the end, it doesn't work, but if you put the number at the beginning, I think then it passes it correctly. Yes, in this case it gets it, but for the most part, right, you're gonna make sure that the number is easy to identify, and otherwise use some other form of manipulation on the string first to extract the relevant information. Last thing to move things between data types, let's look at the date, right? We can also, of course, do that. So we can tag our date and we can turn it into a string. So we type format and then now it is a string. Looks pretty much the same, right? So it's not, there's no way for us to spot whether something is a date type or a string type just by looking at it like this. But we then see it from the operators, right, that we get when we type in there. Now this one won't have the other date operator thing, right? We see all these operators, they all do something with strings, and we can't do the, the date between, for example. We can, however, pass date, right, to figure again out from this string what is the actual date. And we can turn dates into numbers. So this is actually quite fun. If we turn it into a number, we turn it into the Unicode, right? So this is actually the number of seconds that have passed since, I think it's the 1st January 1970. So it gives us a whole thing in seconds, and we can multiply it. We can alternatively get this also, right, if we use the timestamp variable, right? So here, this gives us the current timestamp of a specific date. So we say timestamp date, same result as doing to number, and sometimes that can be nice to equal some things or like figure out, okay, how do we do some certain math on it? For the most part, though, it's not something that we'll need. Now that we understand data types, we can move on to the next part of the video, where we'll go over the most important operators that you're going to use with Notion formulas all the time, and combine it with some of my favorite use cases for formulas. So you learn 2 things at a time, right? How to use the individual operators, and then some very useful formula examples. The first formula operator will be one that's actually independent of all the data types that we learned, and that is the if statement. You probably know it, right? If you've ever written any formula anywhere, because it's just so handy to help us, based on certain conditions, fill out certain data. Now, one of my favorite use cases for if statements in Notion is to use it for data validation, or to give some user feedback for input that is needed. And that is really useful either if you use it alone, right? If you just want to be reminded, okay, here's something where I still miss entries, or you can use it, right, if you have if you are in a team and want to make sure that they fill out everything that they are supposed to fill out. So let's look at this CRM, right? We have name, city, and then email, responsible, and last check-in. We want to make sure all these properties are filled out. To do so, let's create our formula property, right? We can call this status or label, and then edit the formula. Now, if we type if, we see that we actually have two if statements or two if operators in Notion. We have if and ifs. And 9 out of 10 times, you basically always want to use ifs. There's just no reason to use if over ifs. What's the difference? Well, if is the traditional one, then right? You put in, as you can see, we put in a condition, and then if the condition is true, we get the first result. If it's false, we get the second result. So we can test this, right? So we can say if true, and this of course is true. We get now true. Otherwise, we want to put in false. Perfect. So we can save this, right? And we see this now resolves true everywhere. If we had put in false here, it will put false everywhere. Of course, not checking a dynamic condition, right? We don't check anything based on other properties. We just hard code it in, but you get the gist. Now, if statements are nice, but they can get problematic, right? If you want to check for several things. If you want to say first, okay, if condition A is true, then give me this. But if that's not true, then I want to check something else and see whether that is true. And if that's not true, I want to check a third thing. And in these cases, right, you write nested if statements, which get very complicated quite quickly. Even with dot annotation, right, it's quite annoying because you still need to go in the bracket here and say now, right, okay, so for the next one, if this is not true, then I want to check whether 1 is equal to 2. And then if that's the case, right, I want true, otherwise I want false, and so on, right? Oops, 2 equal signs here, of course. And if you do this, right, it can get quite overwhelming quite quickly. So in general, we always want to write ifs, because ifs allows us to just check one condition after another. We can write the first condition true, then we can the second condition, and so on and so on. And even if we only check for one condition, it still works exactly the same. So my recommendation, always use ifs over if. So how do we use it now to create labels? Well, we have our different elements, right? So for example, email, we want to check that the email is filled out. So we can say, look, so email, and now in order to check whether something is empty or not, we can simply type dot empty, right? Empty is another function which simply checks whether the value that we input is empty. Super useful in these situations. And we say if this is empty, then let's say no email. Otherwise, say all good, and then we can close our brackets. And now we say currently it says no email everywhere. But if I now put hello at matthiasfrank.de in here, it now tells us, well, all good. We have now some data filled in. So this is quite nice. But of course, we want to now adjust it, right? And we want to tell it, well, if the email is filled in, we need to make sure the responsible one is also filled in. So it can go in and adjust it. Now, since we're writing now a longer formula, I recommend that you use what we talked about earlier and move these things on new lines. So it will make it much easier for you to read, right? So we say ifs, and then first condition, email empty, then give me no email. And now, after this, we can check for our next condition. So we're actually going to move this a little bit further down the line, right? So that it doesn't disturb us. And now we can go in here and say, okay, if the email is filled, well, the next thing we want to check is responsible, empty. And if that's the case, well, then let's say no responsible. And then confirm, right? And you get a gist now. Here it tells me no responsible. And the second I assign myself here, we go again to all good. And then just to complete it, right, we would, as the last thing, check for last check-in and say, well, if this is empty, then give me, no check-in recorded. You can put any if string in here, right? And then close it off with our all good statement. Now I can further improve this. So for example, one thing that we might want to do is you want to actually reference the name of the person, right? So what you could do is, where it tells us here to no email, we could say, well, give me the name of the entry that I have, right? And then plus the no email. And then I want to make sure that we have also a space in between, right? So I can either add a space here in front of it, or like the space in between, right? Like with this strategy to make sure we now take the name of the person and then say that this person doesn't have an email for these, right? So Anne has no email, Laura has no email, Don has no email. Could of course then maybe write something like has no email or is missing an email. Perfect. Now we're missing this still, of course, for the status, right? Because we only did it for one. So we would need to do it now on all 3 levels. Now let's use this opportunity to learn about 2 new operators. The first one is one that you probably use all the time, particularly if you want to create any sort of display, and that is style. basically, whenever we have a string output, right, so some text, we can use style to apply all the formatting that we could apply to Notion text in general, right? So bold, italics, strike through, underlines, and font colors and background colors. In order to do so, let's just quickly cut this out and look at how it works. So we take the name and then we say dot style, and we see if we inspect the style one that we can give it a bunch of styles as arguments. They all need to be strings, right? So we need to encapsulate them all in quotation marks, and we need to separate them with commas. So in order to make something bold, let's put in a small b. If you wanted to make this italics as well, right, let's put in a small I. If you wanted to make it, a blue color, let's type in blue. And if you want to make it a gray background, right, let's type in gray background. Pretty nice. I mean, very ugly, but you get the gist. Now let's assume that we want to use this fairly ugly styling to highlight the name of the person, right, in our statement. So in order to do so, we can remove this quickly, right, and just go back to our previous formula. And now what we could, of course, do is we could say, okay, wherever we have the name, we type dot style and so on and so on. But then we would need to write this 3 times, right? If we have more conditions, we need to write it 5 times, 6 times. And if we ever want to update the styling, right, maybe if our boss comes back and says, well, it would be cool if all the names are in red, that would be pretty annoying because then we need to update it in all these different places. So second operator that we're going to learn about is let, which allows us to declare variables. Now, oftentimes you don't need that, right? Most of your Notion formulas will be quite simple, but sometimes, particularly if you have to repeat yourself a lot with certain statements, for example, with style statements, but also later when we work with arrays and we need to retrieve certain elements, it will be very relevant. Then it's easier to just write a statement once and then use it several times in your formula. So here's how variables work in Notion. What we can do is we can simply type let or let's, right? So same idea as with if. Let allows us to declare one variable. Let's allows us to declare several variables. So again, usually makes sense to use let's, and the structure is fairly simple. We need to give it the variable. So what's the name for the variable, right? So for example, a. Then we need to give it the value for the variable. And then when we are done, we give it the expression where we want to use it. So let's say we want to say let's variable is our variable name. And then, hello world is the value. And then when we're done declaring all our variables, we can simply type our expression. So we can say variable and then close it off. And now it prints out this. Now, if we wanted then to, say variable, our variable was actually something we want to combine with something, right? We can just write our normal formula expression down here. So I could say, hello world, this is awesome. And then we see, okay, now it uses our variable value here in the expression. That is, of course, a bit abstract, so let's do it in our specific example, right? So let's say we have our, our styling. So we use the name variable or the contact. Let's call it contact. And we say the contact will always be the name. And then we want to style that name. We want to style it B. We want to style it italics. We want to style it with blue. And we want to style it with gray background. Perfect. And then we can go here and we can say, okay, now just give me, contact. And if I do that, we will go back to our, what is wrong? And we need closing brackets here. If we now return, right, we get our names across all the lines. So far, we don't really need a variable for this, right? Because we just now print out the same thing across all segments. But if we combine it now with the if statement, right, where we check for several conditions and always want to put name plus and some other information, then it will make sense. So let's extend this information, the formula. So instead of saying we just print out a contact, what we can then do here is we can now go in here and say, well, we have our ifs formula now. And here we can say, so, well, if the email is empty, then print out contact plus is missing email, right? And otherwise, if the, what else did we have? If the responsible dot empty, then print out contact plus is missing responsible. And last but not least, if the last check-in is empty, then print out contact plus is missing check-in. And now here, right, this makes sense because we can now see we have our different statements across the board depending on what is missing in the individual entries. And if we ever want to change something, I was just seeing we have a space missing for this one. If we ever want to change the formatting, right, we want to change it to red, it's one line that we need to update and not 10 lines in order to make this happen. Now with these two general operators out of the way, let's move on to the more string specific ones. Because with text, there are a few cool things that we can do. We've already seen one of the main use cases of how we use strings in Notion formulas, and that is simply using this plus thing to combine, right? We didn't really talk about it, but whenever we have strings, we can simply use plus in between them, and then we can just build longer sentences with dynamic data, right? So for example, we can have our context here, and that is that we can then input here. Another example would be, right, if we wanted to create some outreach message, right? If we say, we want to create a mail merge, some dynamic content, you might know it, right? If you might have people in your CRM and you want to email them all a message, well, we can easily customize that message by simply saying, well, okay, let's click here, create a new formula property. Let's call this our, outreach message. And then here we could say, well, for like our general part, so we can say in quotation marks, hello, space, right? Because it always gets connected directly. And then plus name, plus it was great seeing you. And then we could input, like the our last check-in date. For whatever reason, we probably would want to format that, but just for the example, right, let's leave it like this. And then maybe something like hope to talk again soon. And now we can save this, right? And now we have our dynamic outreach message with the person. Hello, Matthias, it was great seeing you, right? We want to add a last outreach day so we actually see the full example. And then we have here, and again, right, you would want to format the date, but we'll talk about formatting dates in a moment. But you get the gist, right? This is an easy way to create these custom outreach messages. Now, one specific trick that you need to know whenever you set up these formulas to combine strings in Notion is how do you get text on new lines, right? I mean, this for a short message is okay, right? You could copy this in your messenger, or you could use an automation that we'll talk about later to send this out to people. But if you have longer messages and want to actually break it up into paragraphs, well, how do you do that? Well, the answer is that we can add something which is called a new line character. The way this works is that we, again, simply type plus, and then what we can do is we can paste in this new line character, which is a backslash and then n. And this will be translated by Notion into a new line. You see there's an empty line now, here, and if I just now continue typing, this is on another line, and close this off, right, we'll see that this is on another line, starts here. So we have our paragraph ending. And I could, of course, now have two of these new blocks, right? If I add another one here, we'll see that we push it by 2 lines. Oops, where's now my missing part of the expression? We have 2 plus lines here. Let's remove that. Now we see we have like a full space in between. So this is how you get text on a new line. And then I would recommend, if you write a formula like this, that you also like push things on new lines in the editor, right? So wherever you have this, let's do something like this. So just so we know visually, right, that our code is supposed to break things up into new lines, and we don't get all confused when we try to read it. Now, one of my favorite use cases for these type of formulas, right, so the string formulas together with new lines, is to build some sort of analytics mini dashboard in Notion. And let me show you what I mean at this example of a post database. We have our posts here, right, they have a channel, and then we have a bunch of numbers, impressions, clicks, and conversions. Now, what would be really nice if we could display this, a bit more visually? So one of my favorite use for this is to go in and say, well, let's actually create a board view, a gallery view. And on this gallery view, what we want to do is we want to go into settings, and we want to make sure that under layout, we first turn off the database typer to make it cleaner. And then instead of card preview, we set this to none. And now what we can do is we can go to our properties and simply turn on the specific properties that we want to see. For example, our channel, and then maybe clicks, conversions, and impressions. That's the general idea, because this is, of course, like in particular for like certain type of information, a really nice way, right, to get these info cards about certain information. This could be, social media posts, but it could also maybe, days in your habit journal where you then see the performance for different habits. But you notice one problem, and that is that we have no labels here, right? If we hover over a number, it tells me that these are clicks and these are conversions. But other than that, right, it's just like 3 numbers, and I can, of course, learn that my first number is always my clicks and my last number is my impressions, but it's not very nice from a UI perspective. However, thanks to our newfound knowledge about formulas, we can simply create display formulas to help us show these better on cards. Now, there are 2 types of display formulas that you need to know. One is a very simple one, and one is a bit more complex. The very simple one is simply used to add context to our information. So what we do here is we create a formula, and I typically like to preface them with display because they don't really serve any other purpose, right? They are only used in our display views. So let's call this display impressions. And all we do here is that we say, well, just give me impressions with the colon. That's all I want, right? In every row, I want this. So in this view, right, it's not very helpful, but let me just duplicate this one, and let's call this clicks, and then show you how this actually looks in practice, because then it will make sense. So these are our impressions, these are our clicks, Perfect. Let's do only two. That's enough. Now we go back to our gallery. And what we can do now is we can go to properties and let's move a step over here. I turn on these two display formulas. Then I sort it the right way, right? Display, impressions, then display clicks, and then we hide conversions now. Now you see, I have now this contextual information here in my database that tells me, well, impressions are 3,000, right? Clicks are 245. And I could, of course, make this even nicer. I could go back, right, and say, okay, here are our impressions. Let's style this, right? We just operator that we learned before. Let's make this bold, so that we have like, an easier way to read it. For clicks, we should probably do the same. But that's method one. The big advantage about this method is, even though it takes up significantly more space than the second method, is that we can still fully edit things, right? So if this is a view where we need to like change the number of impressions, we say, actually, this was now 4,500, then this allows me to do so. The second method uses space more effectively. So in particular, for a lot of information, it's better, but it won't allow us to easily update the information with one click. Here's how the second method works. So let's go back to our table and let's create a new formula, and let's call this performance. We could also add display to it because it's mostly used for this purpose, but let's leave it like this. What we want to do here is now we want to print out all the information we care about in one single formula. So in order to do so, let's start with our impressions again, right? Impressions, and let's style, let's do this, and let's style them directly in bold. And then we want to combine this with the actual number of impressions. And we need a space here, of course, so that it doesn't mess it up. Then we want to add our plus, our new line. Maybe a second line, we can think about it in a moment. But then after that, we want to have, another plus here. We want to have our clicks. Also dot style in bold plus clicks. And then last but not least, we want to have again on a new line our, what was it? I think conversions with dot style in bold, and then our conversions. Perfect. And now what you'll see is we get all that information in one row. Like this is currently not set to wrap. So that's another thing that you might stumble upon right while you're building all these formulas. Even though you add new line characters, it doesn't wrap on new lines. Well, that's because you have deactivated wrap columns. So that's activated wrap columns and now displays the right way. Although usually, right, we wouldn't do this in our table view. Usually we would use this in our gallery view. So now we can go in here, right, turn on our one performance metric, and also here make sure that we actually have, where is it, performance here, that we wrap this in the view and get it on all new lines. And you see, this now is a much more condensed way to show a lot of information rather than this other way. But of course, since it's a formula, I can't click into the number 4,500, right? I can click on into the whole formula, so it doesn't allow me to edit it from this view. So which one you will use will depend on the specific situation, right, where you build this formula. Oftentimes, this one is very good if you have just few information and users are supposed to edit it. But if there's a lot of stuff that you need to do and you also want to add additional, context to it, creating these display formulas is really, really powerful. Now, not really a formula tip per se, but don't forget that you can add emojis whenever you want, right, through the emoji picker. So on Mac, that is Control-Shift space, I believe, and on Windows, it is dot plus the Windows key. That opens your keyboard emoji picker, so you can add any type of emojis in here, right? So maybe I want some eye for the impressions, and I want is there a click thing? No, like a mouse, maybe. Yeah, maybe it's the mouse here. And for conversions, let's take the money, and then again, right, just a simple touch to make our gallery display look that much nicer. Next, let's look at substring, which is a lot more niche of an operator, but sometimes really useful. So what does substring do? Well, if we look at formulas, right, and then we look at the substring operator, it tells us that it will return a part of a string, right? So we can basically give it a bigger text, and we give it a starting number and an end number, and we'll give us the text from these numbers. So, right, if we take the substring from Notion from 0, again, similar to arrays, the first one will be 0, and 3, we get not, right, the first 3 letters of Notion. Now, when might this be useful? Well, in this example, we have a bunch of invoices, which are always formatted the same way, right? We have this initial part, then we have the year, and then we have the invoice number. Now, if we have to extract from this list always the specific year, and you don't want to have to do this manually, right, but automated, we can do this very easily with substring, because we know that we always need the element from 0, 1, 2, 3, starting at 4, right, and then 4, 5, 6, 7. So basically from 4 to 7, that's what we want to get with substring. So let's do this, right? Let's take our title property and let's use substring and let's input 4 and 7 and 4 and 8 actually, as I can see in the preview. And now we get, with just one click, our years. Now, so far, right, this is still a string because remember, substrings, of course, it retrieves a string. So in this case, right, if we want to be year and be able to then sort by it, we would then still need to use our skills from earlier to turn this into a number, right? So let's say number, and now we have actually the years, and now we could use sort, right, by our formula. So we have like now sorted ascending by the year when this invoice was sent. Next operator is contains, and that's exactly what you would think it does. We see whether a large string contains a smaller string. Example here, we have a blog post, and we want to build this mini tool that tells us whether we did write a good title for the blog post. Right? And one thing that we want to make sure of that is the keyword that we tie for our blog post is actually contained in there. So let's create a formula to check for that. Let's call it keyword present question mark edit formula, and very simple. We get our title, and then we say contains, and then we input our keyword. Then we can click on save, and now we will get checkboxes, Booleans, remember, because it's like a true or false question. And we see, well, SEO techniques is not included here, content marketing is here in there, SEO strategy is missing there, and so on and so on. Now, one important thing with this, you see technical SEO, technical SEO. In this case, we actually have it in there, but it is not spelled exactly the same way. And contains checks just very straightforward, is it all the same? You know, like it has to be 100% and in this case sensitive. Now, sometimes you want that, right? Sometimes you want to make sure that it's spelled exactly this way, but sometimes you want to just check whether it's present in general. The easiest way to ensure that that's the case is to use another very niche string operator that you can use to make everything lowercase or uppercase. So in order to do this, before we do our comparison, right, let's go in here and say the title should be lower, right? This will converts the whole text to lowercase. And our keyword, right, in case we have our keyword maybe spelled differently, we're going to also turn this to lower. Now, if we do this, we see that this also results to true because we have in both cases everything lowercase. Let's use this opportunity actually to talk about two other generic operators that are very useful when it comes to logic, right? So these true or false statements. And these two examples are and or, right? Whenever you check for conditions, sometimes you want to check for several conditions at once. And or allow you to do this, right? With and, we can check whether several conditions are true, and with or, we can check whether at least one of these conditions is true. So let's say, for example, we want to make sure that we always, in our blog posts, not just use the keyword, but also always Notion, because we just write for Notion. So in this case, what we do, we would say and then we paste in the first part, and then we paste in, and then we do like, comma, and then we say we want to also make sure that it contains, and then we can just put in Notion, right? Because we actually want to hard code this and make sure it's of our condition. And now currently nothing results to true, right? But if I just add Notion in here now, it actually should get the correct. So why it doesn't do that? Let's see whether we did any mistake. So we check whether our title contains the keyword, and we check whether our title contains Notion. This should actually result to true. Let's see whether, where's the issue? There. Here it works. Wait, it doesn't work because we don't have SEO techniques. I'm stupid. I forgot. You of course have only one condition true here. That's why it doesn't result to our checkbox. If that is what we want to check for, right? We want to check whether it has either Notion or the keyword, then we'll simply replace our AND operator with or, and now it behaves the way I expected it, right? This is true because it doesn't contain the keyword, but it contains Notion, and the others are true because it at least contains the keyword. Now let's make this a little bit more robust. We want to add a second condition here, or like a second check, and that is whether we are within the recommended maximum title length, right? SEO titles should not be longer than, I think it's 65 characters or so that they don't get cut off in Google. So we know this operator already, we touched on it earlier, but we haven't looked at a use case yet. So this would be a use case for length, right? So let's go in and say we want another formula. In this case, like let's like the title, and we want to say, okay, give me the title and give me the length of it. That's, of course, the first simple step, right? We simply get how many characters we have in this title. Now, if we wanted to make this a bit more useful and say, okay, instead of just seeing the number, I want to get like some input, whether it's okay or not. We can combine this with our if statements from earlier. So let's take all of this out, and let's say we are going to write a formula. And we're actually going to use the variable as well, because otherwise we have to keep typing, title.length. So let's say let will be, and just to keep it short, let's use here I, and let's say let I be our title length. And then we want to say, well, if I is smaller than 60, then please output green and say great length space, and then actually give me the length character here. Oops, why do we have currently an error? Let's just close this off so we can make this easier. We have here great length, perfect. This is a comma, there's a comma. Where's our current error in it? We forgot, of course, the if statement. Oops, that is my bad. So we actually need to have ifs here, right? And now this will work. Now we can close them all up. Now results to correct my bad. So, and we want to have the length here, the actual plus I, right? 50 plus, and let's say characters. Perfect. And then we can continue this, right, and say, well, if the otherwise we want to output something in red, right? We're going to output red and say, this is too long. This is too long. Perfect. And now, depending on how the length is, right, let's make actually something a bit longer. And at some point, we will get to our, this is now too long statement, right? Let's wrap this, the column, and get it closer so we can actually see it better. And now we have built this sort of dynamic indicator, right, on our text. And as we add information to our title, so as we change things, it updates the tooltip. Now we can combine this with pretty much all the lessons that we learned so far in the string part and make this into like a big display rather than just the one for length, right? So what we could do, we could go in here and say, well, please add a new line, please add another new line, right? We want to have like a separator. And then after that, we want to have the keyword present, right? So we can say keyword present, question mark. And then we can combine this with our overall, oops, yeah, sorry, there's a double plus, we don't need this. We want to combine the keyword present with the result from this other formula that we have. We could, of course, also write it in here, but we just leave it like this for now. And then we can click on save. And now we see great length, 50 characters, keyword present, true. So that's how easily you can turn Notion into a real app that gives the user feedback based on their inputs. Now we can't talk about strings and formulas without talking about regex. So this will be the last part of this chapter on strings. And bear with me, because regex can be a little bit complicated. But if you just understand some very basic concepts about it, it can be super powerful, particularly thanks to AI. So regex stands for regular expressions. And it's a way to tell the computer what sort of parts of a string it should match in situations where it's not as obvious, right, as, like giving everything between 1 and 5. The problem, of course, is that if, data varies, we need some way to translate to the computer, to the algorithm, what elements we expect it to grab. And this sounds a bit abstract, but there are like a lot of very practical use cases where you need to do data cleanup and you need to extract certain elements from a string, but don't quite know where it actually is in that string. Let's look at this example. We have my friends, and we have an address for these people. And we want to get the city from all these addresses. Now, one way, of course, again, might is use AI autofill and just tell AI, please extract the city. That's one of the reasons why AI is so helpful, because it makes it really easy to extract information from unstructured data. But if we don't want to use AI and want to do it a good old-fashioned way, maybe because we want to have a more scalable thing and don't all the time query AI, we can do this using a regular expression. Because what we can observe, right, is that every time in the address, it goes until the comma, and then we have the city. So if you could just have a way to tell the Notion formula, well, remove everything, like just give me the word after the comma, then it would be good. And that's exactly what regular expressions do. Now, in order to use regular expressions in Notion, most of the time, what we will use is the replace all feature, right? So replace all, what it does, it takes a string, then it takes a pattern. That is what we call sort of like the command in regex, right? If we tell it that what is the thing that we want it to match, and then we will replace it. Now, let's look at how this actually works in practice. So let's take the address, and then let's use replace all on it. And remember, we first need the pattern. In this case, let's actually give it string, right? Let's give it something that like an actual word, a full string. And we say, well, we want to replace the string with nothing, exclamation mark, something like this. And then we'll save it. And then what we'll see is in the addresses where we had street, it replaces street with nothing. So you can use replace all also just, to modify some information. And like, for example, if you need to swap out the name of a person, everything, or if you, rebrand it, something like that. Instead of like just replacing with something else, we can also, of course, just have an empty string here, and then it removes it from the string, right? So now we have Maple Street turns into Maple. That's the basic concept of replace all. But now, instead of, giving it street, we will give it a regular expression to tell it, well, don't just match, this random thing, but match dynamically whatever happens until the comma. The regular expression for this looks a bit like that. And this is fairly complicated to read. So unless you happen to know how to write regex, what I would recommend is simply go to your AI chatbot of choice, right? ChatGPT, Claude, whatever it is, and ask it to give you the simplest regex to match and then whatever you want it to match. So in this case, right, what I told it is please give me the simplest regular expression to match everything until the first comma in a string, including that comma. So and you see the result works because like our replace all, it matches all these elements until the comma part, and then we replace it with nothing, and then the only thing that's left is the city. So you see how powerful this can be to extract specific data from a longer string. Another example. Here we have now people, right? They have registered for our event, but we forgot to collect the first name. So what we want to do is we want to use a regular expression to extract everything before the address symbol, because that's hopefully their name. So in this case, same idea. Right? We go in, we say email, replace all, and then the expression in this case, again, I asked just AI to give it to me, is iterate.star, right? It says like match iterate symbol, and then dot star means match everything that comes after. And then we see again, right, we actually don't even need to put in for replace all the empty string, and Notion will automatically assume if we don't put anything in there, that it should just remove that. So you can click on save, and now we have Sarah, Michael, James, perfect. Now we can use that, right, for our outreach to actually contact them and sound like we actually know them, rather than just, like being like, hey there. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking about number operators, because math is something that we probably did learn in school. So it's a bit more intuitive for us, right? Like what things we can do with numbers than with strings or the other data types. So for numbers, let's just very quickly, right, put any number into our Notion formula and look at sort of the operations that we can do with it. We have, of course, always find our logic operators. So and, or, not, and empty, right? We can call this anything. We can use format to tie it to a string. And we have a bunch now of the actual math operators. Right, so we have add, subtract, multiply, and then down here divide, which are just the full expression rather than the symbol. You can of course always type just a plus symbol, and we'll do the same. We have more than power if you need to do some exponential calculations. We have min and max, which is quite nice if you need to check for like the smallest or the biggest number in a series of numbers. That will be very useful also with arrays later. We can get the average, right, or our median with median and mean, very useful because it's like rolled up into one place and we don't need to do some complicated calculations. And then we have ceil and floor, which can be quite useful in some situations where we want to round either to the top or to the bottom for certain elements, or of course also the general round operator. So as you can see, there are a bunch of other operators than if you want to do some more math calculations, but these are pretty much the ones that you will use all the time. And in terms of examples, or whenever you need to do that calculation, right, I think that is fairly straightforward and self-explanatory. But if it isn't, right, if you would like to see more examples, then let me know down below in the comments, and then I will do a separate video just on these math expressions. Now let's talk about dates in Notion formulas. Dates are great because you actually barely need any formulas, right? There are pretty much 3 specific formulas that you need to know about dates. But if you know them, they unlock a huge amount of use cases for all your builds because dates pop up a ton of times in your Notion databases. So the first one I want to look at is format date. And it's very useful to get a date in a specific format. Because as we've already seen, right, previously in our string example, when we wanted to input, well, when we met with someone, was quite annoying because Notion just put this weird format. So being able to enforce how a date looks like is really, really useful. So let's say, for example, we want to figure out what are the months, right, that people have birthdays in. Now, in order to do so, let's click a new formula property here. Let's call it formula. Let's call this birthday month. And then for edit formula, what we want to do is we want to grab our birthday and then type dot. And we see already, right, then the specific operators that are available here. And we could do dot month, right? This returns from a date always the number, right? But like we don't want to have 7. We want to actually have the name of the number month. So in this case, for that we need to use format date. And how format date works is you give it a date, right? Then you tell it what format it should be. And then optionally, you can tell the time zone. Most of the time, you can skip this, right? Because it will just take your current time zone of the account. So we'll just focus on format. And the way you input format is, as you can see, as a string. That's this weird sort of, NMMDY method. Now, this is like actually an official way to write date formats, right? And you can Google actually for them to see all the different versions. Most of the time, it's fairly self-explanatory, but sometimes you have to play a little bit around with it to figure out, okay, what actually, leads to which date output. In our case, we want the month, right? So inputting the 4 M's and closing off with the brackets means that if we now press enter, we get, the full string of the month. And just to show you, right, like how changing this, modifies it, if I just put 2 M's in there, we get 7, right? So we get 07, which is actually a string, right? 07. It's not just the 7, but sometimes that might be useful. Or if you put in 3, when I get the shortcut, right, the first 3 letters of the month. So you see a bunch of options. And I can, of course, also just add to this, right? If I want to have 3 of that, and then I want to have, for whatever reason, 2 of the year, right? June 56, June 49, whatever it is, right? These are then the ways how you can do that. Format date, besides just allowing you to, output the date in a specific way, is also very useful when it comes to doing certain date comparisons. For example, if you want to check whether our last meeting was, this week or this month, the easiest way to do so is using format date. So let's say we want to check last meeting, right? And want to check, did we meet this month? So we say last meeting. So we say format date. And I want to say, please give me the month of this, right? And then we want to say, well, is this equal to, and then in order to get the current time, we can use either now, which gives me a timestamp of the actual minute, or if we just care about the day, right, we can use today. Most of the time this is interchangeable. Today is just a quicker way if you anyway need a date, but it doesn't really matter if we put format date afterwards, because then we anyway saying, right, we want to get the month of it, and we can click on save. And now we can see, did we meet in, who all did we meet with this month, right? So we have January here, we have January here, and we have January there. Now, the formula, of course, is a little bit, it's not 100% there yet, right? Because we just check for the month, we don't check for the year. So we want to also make sure, right, that it's actually this year. We should add just like anything in there, right, that indicates that it's 25, to just double check that we still really met them this year and not, like last year. So if I just were now to go in and put here 2024, right, it will be unchecked now because it's no longer true. Another typical use case for these date comparisons are tasks, right? To-do lists or projects. For example, if I want to check, is the due date today, right? We write this very simple formula, and we can just check, is the due date equal to today, right? And don't do now, because now gives you the minute, and the due date is actually always at midnight, right? If you don't have a date in Notion, a time at a date in Notion will always default to midnight. So if you compare then to something with a specific minute timestamp, it will never default to equal. So you need to make sure it is today. And then we see, well, okay, to Jan 29th, that is checked. And just to show you the comparison, right, if we instead were to do now, it is unchecked because it is not midnight on Jan 29th right now. So that's one version. Another thing that you want to check often for dates, right, is it due this week, right, the task? So in order to that, we would take the due date and we again write format date, our Swiss Army knife in these situations, and a small W gives me the current calendar week. So I check whether the calendar week of this date is equal to the calendar week of, and then I can now use format or today, right? Doesn't matter because we anyway use format date on it. Again, small W, and then we see is something due this calendar week, right? So if I had this tomorrow, it would still be checked. If it was here on yesterday, on Monday, it would also still be checked. Now, how about checking for overdue tasks? Well, that's also fairly straightforward. What we need to do is we need to take our due date and we want to ask ourselves, is our due date smaller than the current date? And that works because if we do these smaller, bigger comparisons, right, Notion just in the background transforms it to a timestamp. Remember, like every date is represented by a timestamp. There's very long number of seconds since 1917, right? That's the regular rule. We count the number of seconds that have passed since January 1st, 1970, and that's the timestamp. So we simply compare, right, is this one timestamp bigger? Is it a number that is bigger or smaller than the other one? But we don't need to type this, right, if we just do the comparison that works. So we ask ourselves, is the due date, is that, is it smaller than the current date, right? So is it smaller than today? And if we check that, then we see, well, it is for Jan 27, right? That is here the case. But for Jan 29th, this still works. And again, here it's important to use today, not now. Because what happens if you put in now, right? You'll see that January 29th is actually checked, because January 29th at midnight at 000 is smaller indeed than January 29th at 10 a.m. in the morning or 4 p.m. in the afternoon. Back to our CRM though, and the next date operator that we need to know about, and that is date add. Let's say we want to see when we should meet someone the next time. So for that, we could put in, for example, a number property and say, maybe we call this frequency. And here we want to say, well, I want to, maybe meet with this person every 150 days, every 50 days, 30, 20, you get the gist. You could also do this with the select property. I'll show you in a second how. But we have something where we want to say, well, in X amount of time, we want to meet a person again. To do so, we again go to our formula and we say, well, this is our, our last meeting. And I want to say date add. There's also actually date subtract, right, if you want to reduce it, but you can simply also use date add and just put a negative number in there. Yeah, it's just the same way. So date add, as you can see, requires you to give the date you want to add something to, then a number, so how much you want to add to it, and then last but not least, the unit of what you want to add to it. So in this case, if we want to say, well, we want to meet at the frequency, and then this advances by this many days, right? If we click on plus, we see then, okay, we go from, what was it here, December 15th to May 14th, and so on, right? It just adds the number of days. If instead we want to do this with months, right, we could simply go in and say, well, and then let's not do frequency, let's just do maybe want to meet every month. So let's say 1 and then months. Oops, months. Yes, perfect. We get the next month when we should meet based on this. And again, right, same drill. If you were to put in year or minutes or seconds, right, you can put all the numeric units in there for the time and we'll simply add it to it. And of course, if you want to reduce it, right, you can just use date add minus. Does the same thing as if you use date subtract. Last operator that you need to know about is date between. We mentioned it earlier already, right? But it's basically how you can compare two dates and figure out how much time has passed between them. So let's say we want to see how long has it been since we last met with that person. So let's get our last meeting, and then let's say date between. And as you can see, date between takes 2 dates, and again, the unit, right? So you want the time passed in days, you want it in minutes, and so on and so on. So I say date between last meeting and today, and I want this in days, and then I can close it off, and I see now, okay, it's been minus 45 days since we last met, and that's because I always mess up this formula. You're actually supposed to put the bigger number first, and then also the bigger date first, and then the smaller date second. So we would actually need to rewrite this right as let's take today, let's say date between, and then take our last meeting and then days, and then we get a positive number, right, which is just a bit nicer to read. We see, okay, it's been 45 days, and then we can combine this with our string lesson from earlier, right, and then, okay, plus, let's do a plus thing and say days since last meeting, right, and now we get this little announcement that we could have on this card, right, if we display it in the gallery, our contact, and see, okay, well, it's been these many days since we last met with the person. Let's wrap up this lesson on dates with a fun little exercise, and that is, how can you calculate the current year's birthday based on someone's actual birthday? And it's a good exercise because it teaches us a few ways of how we have to think about Notion formulas if it gets a bit more advanced, and that there are often several ways to get to our destination. So what is one option? Well, if I look at this, I see, well, okay, we have July 9th, right? And then we have the year. I could just use format date to grab the month and the day, right? And then just remove the year from it. And I can just take this year's year, right? So that should work. Let's try. So let's go in and say we take now the birth day, right? We say format date. And I want to have the month, right? Day. Perfect, it gives me July 9. And then I will just tag onto this, right? Sort of as a string. I will tag on today. And I will also say, well, okay, today, same idea, format date. Month, and I want here the year. And now I have July 9, 2025. Amazing. I have this year's birthday. But there's a problem. This is a string currently, right? So strings, as we've learned before, right, they're not very useful for our sorting and stuff like this, right? We couldn't say, well, sort them now in descending order or whatever. So in order to update this, right, if we wanted to have the order of when they have birthdays, we need to somehow turn this into a date. Luckily, we might remember from earlier that there is a pass date function, right? There is something where you can turn something into date. So we could, in theory, just wrap all of this and then say, no, please pass the date. In this case, this actually will result in an error though. Because when we see, if I save it now, right, it doesn't show anything. And I learn why if I inspect pass date, because it tells me I need to input it in this specific format. I need to have year, dot the month, I think it is, and then the day. But of course, we could just adapt our formula, right? We could say, well, no problem. Let's just take, we need to have, let's remove the space here. Let's just take the today part, right? Let's take this, put it in the beginning and say, okay, so we need the year, then we need the plus, then we need this line, then we need a plus, then we need the birthday, and we need then month, dash, day, right? And now you see our formula works and we actually get a fully functional date out of this. Pretty cool. So that's one way, right, to achieve this with Notion formulas. Another way to do this would be by doing some math, right? We could also take the birthday and we could try to figure out, well, how many years do I need to add to it to get to, today's year? And that is fairly simple, right? We take, take today and we say, well, today, date between, how far is, to today's year from the birth year? So we take the birthday and we say we want this in years. How many years has it been since that person was born? Which accidentally also, will give us the age. Give or pass with some logic where we need to make sure that the birthday is actually passed. So today, day between, birthday years. Perfect. We have that. Now we can, all we need to do is we need to add that to the actual birthday. So we say birthday dot date add, right? And we can paste in our whole formula here and say, please add years to this. And same result, right? We get now the last birthday plus the current years. You see though that it's all like still short by one because the duration between, right, like is always only the years between doesn't, we're missing the 1 year. So all we would need to do by this date add, we would need to add 1 to this whole thing. So we can just include, date between, blah, 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 where the date add, we would just wrap this in another bracket statement and say, plus 1. And now we get correct as well. And we get the current year. Bit of a different approach, right? But both of them lead to the same result. Then we can, of course, now expand this logic, right? Make it more dynamic, more robust. We could say, well, show me always the next birthday of a person, right? Which would probably mean that we take our whole statement and we check, well, is this bigger than or smaller than now, right? And if it is smaller than now, well, then it means it has already passed. So we need to push it by another year into the future. For that, right, we would wrap all the things together. We would probably use let a variable to make sure that we don't have to write this expression all the time, right? So you see, it can get quite advanced quite quickly. But this one I won't show you, right? Like, please try to do this yourself. Right? Try to figure out how to write a formula where you can show the next upcoming birthday always. If you get stuck, let me know down below in the comments and I can help troubleshoot. When it comes to Boolean operators, we basically already covered everything on the way so far. Because turns out they are very useful in a lot of the other expressions. But just to wrap things up, right, and make sure you have everything in one place, let's quickly go over them again. Boolean operators are everything where we check whether something is true or false. So it's mostly comparison operators. For example, it is this one, right, where we say, is the due date smaller than now? Or is it equal to now? Or is it not equal to now, right? These are our most common comparisons. Smaller, bigger, equal to, not equal to, or then of course, right, also you can do the combination of, smaller or same. That's step 1. Step 2 is then to check for several things at once, right? So for example, let's say we have here a status on these tasks, and for some of them we have we want to check whether for like the due date, like overdue, we want to only display overdue if it is in the past and it has not been done yet. So in order to check that, right, let's say due date should be smaller than now. Then we use and, so we wrap the whole thing with and then say, like first condition is due date is smaller than now. Second condition is that the status is not, right? We use 2 comparisons here, is not done. And then we can wrap everything small. And just like, a side note, when it comes to like and or operators, you could also use the dot notation, right? Works the same way. In this case, I actually prefer the bracket notation because it means, right, I can see, well, everything inside these brackets should be true and I can put everything on separate lines. So it makes it for me much easier to read the formula, but this personal preference works both ways. So let's check that. Let's make sure, well, yeah, this is, like overdue and has not been signed yet. But if I set this now to done, right, it gets, remove the checkbox because now no longer are both conditions true. A few other things you might want to check for. One of them is empty, right? Dot empty. Also, as you can see right in the front, will always result in a checkbox. So I see, is the due date empty? No, it's not. But if I clear the state now, right, it gets checked because now it is empty. In combination with that, often quite useful is not, right? Not simply inverts whatever statement you have, right? So it turns a true into a false and a false into a true. So if you want to check whether something is filled, right, you say .empty, .not, and then you can see, well, yes, all of these have been filled correctly. And last but not least, for Booleans is of course like the actual just statements, right? False, false, and true. We talked about them before. It's not really operators, right? It's just like passing in the value true or false into your formula, and it resulting into a checkbox or not, or using it in if statements or wherever you need. Sometimes just like the actual statement, right? Rather than an expression. Now it's time for the most fun formulas that you can possibly write in Notion, and they're all about arrays. Now, this is probably the most complicated part, but it's also the one that will really, really level up your skill set, right? If formulas so far were quite fun because you were able to manipulate strings and, show certain new dates based on information in your database, arrays will take this and get it to a whole nother level. So let's take a look at some very basic things we can do. Here we have a simple setup that is very typical in Notion. We have projects and then we have tasks, right? And you will have this all the time where you have a relation between your databases, right? And you group elements from one database, in this case tasks, together with one from another. And that's where now our array formulas shine, because relations, right? That's one of the key areas where we end up with arrays and lists in Notion. So if we wrap this form on, right, we'll see, okay, we have a bunch of elements linked to it. And as we learned previously with data types, right, it basically means we have this box and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 entries here in this first box, and then consecutively less for the other ones. So what's the first thing we can do in order to learn about them? The easiest formula that you can probably write is the one that sees how many elements you have in an array. So let's do that. Let's go in here. So add a formula. If I want to figure out, the number of my tasks for any given projects, what I would do is I would simply take my relation, dot, and then length. And now it counts the number of items in this relation. Now, this, if you worked with Notion a little bit before and you are more of an advanced user, then you might recognize one thing. And that is that the result of this formula is pretty much the same as if you were using a rollup. If you don't know rollups, let's just have a quick look at them, right? So if I add a rollup to one of my database, what I can do is I need to always define a relation, right? Rollups always work together with a pre-existing relation, whereas relations connect entries in databases. Rollups give me information about that connection. So I can say, give me tasks, and then give me the task here, that's fine. And then where it says calculate, rather than showing the original, I could also say count all, right? And now I get exactly the same result as if I write a formula with relation.length. So why would you ever bother writing a formula rather than just using a rollup? Well, this is actually a fairly recent update, right? Notion released much more powerful formulas last year, and for the first time, this allows us now to replicate a lot of the functionality that previously was only in rollups. So kind of rollups are to a certain point redundant or have a bit of overlap with formulas for arrays, but formulas give us even more capabilities afterwards, right? It allows us to do more things with that result. With rollup, all I can do is count this, right? And then some other operations, but with a formula, I have full control over the result. So most of the time, you want to use formulas rather than rollups. There's one scenario where you still need to use a rollup because the functionality hasn't been added to a formula, but I'll mention that later when we get to it. Now, length was easy, but now let's look at the first really, really powerful operator when it comes to arrays, and that is map. Now, map basically replicates the functionality in a rollup that allows us to pull a specific entry property from another row, right? As you might know, if we have our relation and we go to our rollup, we configure it, we can say what property of the related entry we want to see here, right? It goes through the relation, picks the information, and allows us to display it here. So our tasks have due dates in their own database and priority levels. So if we wanted to see them here on the project, we could say, well, on the rollup, please give me the due date and then show the original, right? And now if I open this up, we see, and maybe wrap it, we see that we have all the due dates from the tasks that have been linked to this entry, right? All of them here. We can do the same now with our formula. So let's go in here, and instead of length, let's say map. Map will be a property an operator use all the time. So it's really important that we get this right. As you can see, map takes a list, right? An array. We have that here already. And then an expression. And what it does, it returns the list populated with the result of what we call for every item in the list. Sounds a bit complicated, but basically we can tell exactly the same thing as for the rollup. We can tell it to go over every single item in the array and return a certain value for it. And we always do this with current, right? Current basically says, well, of the item you will look at every item in this array, and from that current item that you're looking at, please give me this. So map always, most of the time starts with current dot, and if you type current dot, you now get access to all the properties that exist on tasks, right? So you see, I take the top, I get the task name, due date, status, priority, and so on and so on. Those are not the properties on the project where I'm actually writing this formula. Those are the properties on tasks. So let's say map due date. Let's click on save, and we see, right, if we ram this, exactly the same result as for our roller. Beautiful. Now again, right, the question is like, why would we do this rather than with the roller? But we'll get to that in a second, because we can do a lot more things now with this formula than we could do with the roller. For example, we can combine now our knowledge about arrays with our knowledge that we have of other operators. So for example, in this case, if we don't care about the year of the due date, well, how do we format dates? You know it. We do it by typing .format date, right? And you see, I can now chain in here, right, inside my command where I say, give me the due date of something. You can say, well, actually give me this due date in a specific format. Give me this due date as just the, day, just give me to me as day, month. That's how I want it. And now you see, we're getting, one step above the rollup, we get it outputted in exactly the way that we want it, rather than this standard date formula, date format that we have here. Now, very important that if we want to do this, we need to call this inside these brackets, because the result of my map, right, the output of it is a list again, right? It returns a list with values. So the output here, even though it doesn't look like it, is actually also an array. And we can check this by typing .length, right? And will still tell us 7, right? It doesn't give us the length of the characters here. It tells us there are still 7 entries in the list. And to double check that, we can say, well, if we actually were to turn this into a string first, right? So remember, format is how we turn anything into a string. And they then say .length, we now get 80, right? Which is the number of characters when we put them all next to each other. Let's take this one step further. We're not limited to returning just one entry here, right? We can tell it to map several things. So let's take current dot, right, closing our bracket, and say, what I would like you to return is the task name, and I would like you to combine this with an empty string, right? And then I would again like to go you over every single entry and return the due date, but format date. I would like to have day, dot month, like day, month. That's what I would like to have. And now, as you see, is I get all my tasks, the task names, with the due date, right? And I could, of course, like now expand this, or I could say task name due on, and let's make this maybe, something like this. And we only need one D here. And now we say, oops, we missed space here. Now our result is we get create client onboarding template due on 15th February, develop custom formula workshop due on 28th February, and so on and so on. Right? We can make it even a bit prettier by telling it as the last thing that we want in here. We want a line break, right? Our new line character, or we could add some formatting to it, right? The world is yours. You can add .style in here. Say, well, make the task name bold, right? Something like this. You see, this is where really formulas start to separate from rollers, because they give you full control over the output and not just like a very specific way to show things. Now let's move on to the second operator, and that is filter. Now, where map goes over an array and gives you for every single entry in the array a certain value back, or whatever values you want, filter allows you to reduce the numbers in an array, right? It will go over every item in an array and check whether a certain condition is true, and only then will it return it. So basically, you're building a new array. Because remember, as we said previously, the cool thing about arrays is that they give us full control over the things that we have in this storage system. For example, we can say, well, in my array, I would only like to have now tasks that are open. And this solves one of the biggest issues that you had previously in Notion. And that was that if you had, any relation, so for example, projects to tasks, you would always see all tasks in here, right? There was no way to say, well, in this relation, please only show me my open tasks. That's not possible. It shows you all entries. But with formulas and filter, we can achieve exactly that. So let's go in here and let's remove this all and start from scratch. We type tasks again, then we type .filter. And here filter, you see again, it takes a list and then it takes a condition. And then it returns the values in the list for which the condition is true. So again, the output of it will be another array or another list, but only with items where our condition is true. Now, how do we check whether our condition is true? Well, again, we use current, right? We go over every single entry in that array and say, well, is current, is that, the condition for this one true? So one thing that we could say is for current, the status, not equal to done, right? This means only if the task is still open will we return it? So then we can click on save. And now we have here our list of tasks. Now, I think this should actually be exactly the same lists, yes, because none of the tasks are done. But if we now go in there, right, and say, okay, for these first 3 ones, let's check them all off. Right? Select them. We say status here is done. And we go back up. Now our formula will have updated, yep, and we only see the 4 remaining tasks. Amazing. So now you could have a list right, where you see only the open tasks for this project right on the database. Now you might have an idea where this is going, because what we can now do is we can combine this with other elements. For example, what we could say is, well, give me the length of this new array. And now I see exactly how many open tasks I have remaining on this project. And I could use now our knowledge from previous parts, right, where we say, okay, we combine things, we create these display formulas to say, for example, open tasks, colon, and then we add the number here, right, and we could also take the whole result that we have here and say dot style and say, well, we want to have this style in bold and we want to have it in red, right? And now we see, okay, we have open here, 4 open tasks here, we have 4 open tasks there, 2 open, 4 open again, right? And if we check off any other task randomly, right, for example, this one and this one, we of course get corresponding updates here in our overview database. Pretty cool, right? We can of course also take this now one step further. For example, we could give us some information on like how many tasks out of how many have we actually done, right? So we have already the first part ready, right? We have open tasks, filter current, and then this. And now if we wanted to add to this how many tasks we have overall, let's go into a new line and say, okay, plus what we want to show here is out of, right? And then we want to have our total tasks in there. And that of course is very easy, right? We did it in the very beginning. It's a task.length. That is all we need. And now we see we have 4 tasks out of 7, right? And we wanted to style this one. Let's make this, bold and gray. Perfect. We see now, okay, we have 4 out of 7 tasks done for this one. Or let's add one more element to this, right? Let's say we also want the percent. So again, right, let's go in a new line just so we organize our formula a little bit and say for progress off. And now we can add here our formula to calculate the percent progress. How do we calculate the percent progress? Well, we would need to divide our number of open tasks, the number of done tasks by the number of open tasks, right? So we would go in and we could simply copy this, or this would also be a good use case probably, right, to actually do some refactoring and put it into variables. But just to keep it simpler here, now let's just copy this. Say, okay, we want to get the ones that are done equal to done. Oops. And we want to divide all of that, divide by the number of tasks that we have. Perfect. This gives us now this weird number. It doesn't round it automatically first, right? So let's continue with our elements here. Let's add like some opening brackets around this and move it up. Sometimes in Notion it's like a little bit, once you need to go like back to the beginning of the line, it's very hard to get your mouse there, but we'll just add our brackets there, and then we say, please round this. Actually, we can't round it, because if we round it to 0, right? Because it's a 0 value. So if you need to round percent values, you need to always multiply first times 100. Then you need to dot divide 100. Multiply 100. Then round, dot round, and then divide by 100. Now 0.43, right? We could also skip the dividing if we want to have it as a percent value, and then could simply add on the percent sign at the very end. And now we have this very complex formula, which turns us open task 4 out of 7 for progress of 43%. Now, that was a little bit, convoluted. So let's just go over just a basic way to calculate the percent progress using the filter formula mostly. All right, so we go in here and we start with tasks.filter. And again, we go over every single entry and we want to check, is the status of this current entry, is it equal to done? And then we get the length of this. Length. Perfect. 3. Amazing. Now let's go into the new line to organize our formula a bit. Say divide 2, this time with the symbol rather than dot divide. And now say we want task.length. And now I get my overall progress right, 0.428 and so on. And then in Notion, right, whenever I want to have some, if it's just a number, not a string, example from previously, but if it's just a number, we can go in here and say init property, number format, this will actually be percent. And then we can set decimal places and we can say, well, please set this to only 1 decimal. Perfect. So the rounding progress, right, we only need to do this if we have it as part of a string. Because in the string, right, we need to format it exactly the way we want to see it. Whereas if the output is a number, we get from Notion some built-in functionality to display it in a nicer way. Now let's very briefly look at a close cousin to filter, and that is find, right? Whereas tasks.filter will return all items for which a condition is true, task.find will return only one entry, the very first for which a condition is true, right? So if you have your task list and you want to say find the one where the current dot status is not done, then it will return the very first item from the list for which this is true. Now, unfortunately, this depends on the order of your list, right? It not necessarily is the next task that you actually have to do, right? Because the order of entries here, that is determined by the order in which you have linked. So if you change due date later, right? So what is it currently? It's client training session ABC. All right. Client training session ABC, right? Feb 5th. Well, if I now go in here, right, and put this date from March 1st to actually before it, right? If I say this is actually due on Feb 3rd, right? In an ideal world, it would already update it. But you see, it's still there because this list is not dynamically ordered. It's just manually ordered when you actually relate it. So how can we use now our knowledge, though, to build a more advanced formula where we actually find the next tasks due in line? This is a great example for a formula and combines a lot of the things that we've done so far. It is also a little bit complicated, but we can get there. So what do we need to do? Well, if we think about it logically, we need to look at all our tasks. Then we need to ignore the ones that are already completed. Then we need to figure out which one has the next due date, and then return that value. So let's try to go step by step. First, we want to get our tasks. And then we want to remove the ones that are already done. And we do this with filter, right? With filter, we can say, only give me a task where the status is not done. All right, that's step one. Now we have only our open tasks in there. Now we want to sort them, right? We want to figure out which is the next open task. Now, if we just put in sort, right, what it will do, it will sort them alphabetically because that's the default value. But we can also tell Notion by what we actually want to sort. And we can do that again by looking at every single entry and telling it what is the value that we want to sort it by. Well, I would like to sort this by current dot due date, right? This is how I want to sort it. I want to have it sorted by the earliest upcoming due date. And then all I would need to do, right, is I would need to pick the very first element from this route, right? If we just type now dot first, we get only the very first entry in this list, which is update Notion best practices, and we can check, is that the one that we actually need to? Update Notion best practices, February 3rd. Perfect. If we move this now to February 1st, right, it should be this one. So if we go back up, we see, yes, client training session, ABC cop. Now, what if we wanted to get the next 3 tasks in a row? Well, we can easily do so. Instead of doing first, we can use slice. Slice allows us to indicate, okay, what elements of a list do we want, right? And we can tell it we would like the elements from 0 to 3. And this should give us the very first 3 entries in it. Client training session, update Notion backpress, and review client setup. Why 0? Well, remember, we start counting arrays from 0. So if we only had 1, 2, 3, we would only get the second entry and the third entry in this list. Together with first, last, and slice, there's one last option that you need to know about to pick a certain element, that is add. Add, right, allows us to specify something specific. So for whatever we don't want the next one, but the one after that in line, we would say add 1, right? And this gives us task number 2 in our due date list. Now, don't forget that since this returns an actual relation value, we're not just stuck with showing it like this. We can format this in any way, shape, or form we want, right? So if we, for example, say, wait, let's give us the first value. Instead of just having this, if we want to have, for example, the task name and the due date, what we can do is type now dot, right? And this gives us, again, access to all the properties that we could print out. If you want to print out several properties, the best way to do this is now to actually copy this whole thing, right? And say use for a variable. So let's say let, open it up, task, be here our relation, and then now we can use it, right? So just to recap what we did here, we want to declare a variable. The name of the variable is task, and then this is what task should be, right? It should be the very first one, the earliest due date. And now what do we want to print out? Well, we want to print out task.task name plus a space, so plus due on, and then plus the due date, right? I mean, we could also like format the due date and just say, give me day and for month science. Perfect. And then we just need to close off our expression. And now we see, okay, our next task is a client training session for ABC New Prop due on February 28th. And of course, we could add anything to it, right? We could have it say next task plus this. We could also add to it the priority, right? So plus priority plus task dot, not tasks, but task dot priority, and so on, right? Whatever values we have in our other database that we want to print out here as sort of this status element, we can grab it through using our expression, ideally together with variables, so that I don't have to retype it all the time. Now that we are well equipped with knowledge about all data types and various formulas operators, it's time to tackle one of the toughest challenges in Notion. And that is, how do we do spreadsheet-like math in Notion, right? You remember at the very beginning of this video, I mentioned that it's very hard to do calculations that you expect in a spreadsheet because Notion is a database, not a spreadsheet. So things like figuring out, well, what is the highest number in something, that can actually be quite tough. So for example, let's say we have here our campaign. And what we can of course do is we can simply sort it by open rate, right? And figure out, okay, what is our best open rate, right? Fairly fine. Okay, this is the best one. But what if we want to build now a gallery view where we show only our best performing campaign, right? Maybe one campaign, maybe 3 campaigns, a custom number of campaigns. We want to display only those. Now in Notion, currently, if we look at our options, right, for a load limit, we can set it to a maximum of 10. So there's no option to say, well, only show me 3 items in database. At the same time, if we had, of course, like another database, right, where we, if, for example, if campaigns were part of a larger marketing initiatives and they were all related there, we could show with the same idea, right, that we showed here on projects, right, the next one in line, we could use the same principle to show on the other database, the one entry. But what we want to achieve here, right, is we want to show on campaigns, right? I want to be able to filter campaigns to show me a little gallery card with only the top performing 3 campaigns. And that is quite tough, but if you know how, it is actually a really cool Notion skill. So let's get into it. The first thing we need to do is we need to build a second database, right? This is true for all these situations. We always need a second database, which we can call just our analytics database. And the whole purpose of this analytics database is to allow us to do, well, math on this database. So what we'll do is we add one entry here. We only need one. We call it analytics. And then we will relate this entry to our campaigns database, right? We want to show it on this one and relation. Perfect. Now we need to make sure that all entries in campaigns are related to this one entry, right? So we say edit property, give me analytics, and link it all to this one entry. Now, if you set this up for the first time, right, you can do this manually by just like selecting everything and linking it. For the future, if you want to have this live update, you want to make sure that you set either a database template, right, where you say sort of like new campaign, and you make sure that every time a new campaign is added, it is always added to analytics, and setting this as the default template. That's one way how you can enforce this, right? The other way of how you can enforce this is by creating a database automation and saying, okay, whenever we have, a new page added, please make sure that edit property analytics is set to this analytics entry. That way, right, we don't need to think about connecting it, and all our calculations update in real time whenever a new campaign is added to this database. Now, this relation is now the cheat code that allows us to do math right on this campaign database. Because rather than going now to analytics and writing our formula here, we can actually write our formula direct on campaigns. So let me show you what I mean. Let's add a new formula property, and let's call this top 3 question mark. And here in the formula, what we can do is we can go to our analytics entry, and we can say, well, from analytics, please map current dot the campaigns, right? Go into the analytics relation and then give me all the campaigns. And with that trick, I now have all the campaign entries on my campaign entry, right? So it's sort of doing some reverse logic here in order to have them all here. And now what we can do is we can use that to ask any question we care about. So let's start by asking the question, which entry has the highest open rate? And in general, this should be fairly straightforward because we've managed to map our campaign array into this one, right? So let's just go over it quickly again, right? We have here in our analytics, we have our array of campaigns. And by writing a formula on campaigns that said, well, go to analytics and get me this array, we now see this array here. But there's one weird challenge first that we need to solve. If we try to call any type of array function, we see that it behaves a little bit weird. So let's say, for example, we wanted to say, give me, please, from every entry in this list, please give me the open rate, right? From every campaign here, I want to see the open rate. I do map, I do current, dot, and there are my properties, right? I don't see any of the properties from campaigns, which I would usually expect, right? Usually the campaign properties should be here. So something is clearly wrong with this array that we've pulled in here. And we can verify this by calling dot length. The length apparently is 1, even though there are like, okay, now we have this, right? The length apparently is 1, even though we clearly have, 7 or 10 entries in here. Why is that? Well, map returns a list of entries, right? So it goes over every entry in analytics and returns what it has there. So in this case, it actually returns a nested array, right? There's the first entry from analytics, or one analytics entry, has these 7 arrays, these 7 elements in it, but it's nested, and that's why we can't directly access it. So long story short, right, this is a little bit complicated. All you need to remember is that if you want to do this, if you in Notion formulas, you want to access elements 1 level or 2 levels deep, right? So you want to go through a relation, grab new relations, and then call something on them. You first need to do one between 7 and this dot flat, right? That's the TLDR. If you do dot flat and then length, you see 8. Okay, now we have all our entries, right? And now we can start calling our operators again, right? So if we were to do map current dot open rate, perfect. Everything is good in the world, right? We now have all our open rates in here. So that's exactly what we want, right? We want the open rates, and then we want to compare whether the open rate equals the open rate of our specific entry. Now there are a few ways to do this. One way that we can achieve this is to say, okay, we have now our open rates, and we're going to sort them. But we can actually write, rather than saying map current.openrate.sort, we can skip the map step altogether and directly call sort, and then just pass the argument current.openrate in there. Right now we order them by open rate. That open rate is ascending though, so if we want to have the highest one first, right, we say then dot reverse, and now we have by highest open rate our array sorted. All that's left to do at this point is to check whether a specific entry in our campaigns database is that entry with the highest open rate, right? So in order to do so, what we can do is we can now go in here and say, all right, is my name? Oh, so we need to get the first one, right? So at reverse dot, let's get the at 0, right? That is the very first entry, and we can simply ask the question, well, is our name, right? How we call it? Is the entry that we're looking at, right? Is that the one that gets returned here at 0? Now, currently this doesn't check anything, right? Because we actually compare this to the object, so we need to also do format, right? So it actually gets turned into text. And now we see, well, which one is our top entry? Power of Notion AI, right? This is correct. We have 58 here, so it's all good. This is how we can easily find the top value from it. But now if you don't want to find top value, but maybe the top 3, we need to slightly adjust things. For this purpose, let's go back into our formula and let's slightly adapt it, right? So let's remove our subject line element here, and then let's go here and say we actually want to stop here, right? We want to go back to this point where we have just our array. And now what we want to do is we want to actually map it. We want to get our different open rates in here, and we want to make sure that we sort them and that we have them in the right order, right? Just to be sure that we have the highest open rate first. Now what we can do in order to check for the top 3s, we can say, well, let's get the third highest open rate, right? So that is at number 2. Remember, 0 is the highest, 1 is the second highest, the 2 is the third highest. The third highest open rate is 52.1. So how do we check whether an entry is in that range? Well, we should simply ask, is our, the open rate of a specific entry we're looking at, is that larger than or equal to this number, right, the 52? And then we click save. We see now we have our top 3 elements checked, right? Because for these 3 open rates, the condition resolves to true, which means at long last, we can now build our view, right? We can now go in here and say, okay, now give me please a board view. I want to, actually not a board view. I want to have a gallery view. I want to see gallery. I don't want to see the database title. I don't want to see the page content. And I want to have a filter set where we say, okay, where top 3 is checked. Now I can have my custom, order of things. If I wanted to see the top 4, I would just increase the at index right by 1. And I can also then start displaying my click rate. If I wanted to, I could use a display formula that we talked about earlier to say, well, this is the open rate or the click rate for this specific entry. And we get these dynamic reports in Notion. Now, this was very complicated. So let's just quickly revisit how the process works, right? We go in, and what we do is we relate everything to our other database. And this other database our array here, can now be pulled back into our main database. And then for every single entry, right, we can ask the question, is this bigger than something? Is this larger than something? Whatever it is. And this helps us work around Notion's limitation, right, of being a database, not a spreadsheet. Because our math can always only happen on one specific entry. But by pulling all the reference data into that one specific entry, well, we can do that math. But of course, there are limits to this, right? This is a very inefficient way to do math, right? A spreadsheet is a lot more efficient. So if you have very large databases with a lot of entries, doing these sort of calculations will slow down your Notion databases, right? If you have a ton of questions like this, self-referential formulas, that is something that can impact the load speed quite a bit. So be careful with where you employ it. But still, in the right situation, it's a very, very powerful tool. This method of using an analytics database has a second benefit though, and it's one that is a bit more performant, right? So it won't slow down your database as much. And that is building analytics for Notion, right? We have actually called it so far, right? And so far we've done our analytics on this database. But what we can also do is we can use this analytics database here to display any kind of information that we want. And this is super useful. It used to be probably the best way to get analytics in Notion before Notion rolled out charts. Right now that we have Notion charts, this method is less needed because oftentimes we can just create charts. But there's still two very important use cases for this. First, if you don't have a paid Notion plan, right, and you want analytics for free, this is perfect. And second, sometimes you don't want a chart, right? Sometimes you want just some output numbers. And that's what we're going to build with this. Let's say, for example, we want to know how many campaigns we have sent. Well, that's a very easy formula, right? We simply go down here, the formula, okay, campaigns number, something like this. And then for the formula, it is campaigns.length, right? Easy peasy. That one is super simple. Now, we can continue. Right? Pretty much any math question we can ask about this, we can answer here. We can ask me, what is our average open rate, right? So let's go formula, add a formula, average open, and we go in and say, okay, please give me campaigns. Please, for every campaign, let's grab the open rate, right? And then from that, I want to have either the median, right, or the mean. We have now built-in functions for this to get that. Super simple, right? We can get our median one, or in this case, we want the average, right? So the mean, we can save it, and we see, okay, we need to also turn this into percent. Our median or average open rate is, 50,000%. Yeah, that's because here it's actually in total numbers. I had the sample data wrong, so let's remove the percent. Let's go back to our number. Then it's correct. Okay, we have 15.625% average open rate. So you see, this is a lot easier than the other method, and only your creativity is the limit. So, for example, let's say we want to know, well, how many campaigns do we have where our open rate is above the average open rate? Well, we could do this and go in here, right, and say, okay, average open is this. This we already know. Now what we want to do is we want to go into campaigns. We want to filter them out, and we want to say, well, only give me the ones where current.open rate, right, is bigger than or equal to the expression that we just wrote, right? And then we can go in there and we can count the total length, dot length, and we can figure out, okay, 4 of our campaigns are bigger than the average open rate, and 4 of them are smaller. In this case, it's very similar to the median, but in case you have some outlier campaigns that drag it very strong in one or the other direction, this might be different. So maybe some useful information to calculate. Now, this is of course not the nicest way to display the information. So let's bring it home and again into something where we use a lot of the things we learned previously and create a nice little display card. So let's create our display formula, display campaigns, and say, okay, campaigns sent plus campaign number, right? Perfect. And then let's create a second one. Actually, let's add it all. No, let's create separate ones, right, for the exercise formula. This is display open rate, and say, okay, here, let's say average open rate plus average open, and here we need to then fix it, right? Let's go back to our previous calculation. We just care about the percent. And now we have these values, right? And then we can go in here and we can create, not a calendar view, meant to add a gallery view, no database title, no page content, and then I can turn on my display properties, how I want to see them, right? Let's say display campaigns and display open rate, and so you have the second one that we don't need deleted. Perfect. Now we have this nice little, info tile. We can embed it anywhere in our workspace. It will tell us, okay, these are our statistics, right? If you want to get rid of this like little new thing, there's unfortunately only one way right now. We have to lock the page, right? Then it disappears. And then we have this very clean view on a page to give us insights into how our business or our workspace is running. Just one last thing here. The main use case probably for this one is to create actually analytics into your task manager. Create like this little personal assistant that tells you, well, you have these many tasks for the day and so on and so on. Very simple, right? Same principles as with the campaigns. We would simply take our analytics database, either the same one or a new one, and create a relation to our tasks. Here are our tasks. Perfect. Two-way relation, right? Relate anything from task to this task database, and then ask questions like, okay, how many tasks are due today, right? Check whether task due date is equal to today, or how many are overdue. Check how many are, behind today's date. How many are this week, and so on, right? So whatever question you want to ask in Notion, right? With this simple method of creating a relation to an analytics database, relating everything, then writing the corresponding formula, you can get all these insights within seconds at your fingertip. Here's how that looks like now if we add a dynamic part, right? Here, we don't multiply it with static numbers, but instead one of the numbers that we multiply it is the current timestamp, right? And the current timestamp updates every minute, which means every minute this calculation will be different. So if we reload the page in 1 minute, these numbers will be different. That means we can then have, like our sort, we can sort by this random number. That means whenever we look at campaigns, right, we would see a random campaign, or if we have quotes, we would see a random quote, and so on and so on. It's a little bit complicated, and I'll create a new video actually separately about, how to create random numbers in Notion, how to use them. I have an old one also linked in the description. It's a little bit outdated, but it still shows the basic principles. Now, before we go to the next big chapter, automations, there's just one tiny little thing that I want to mention, and that is something we touched upon much earlier, where we said our formulas are very similar to rollups, right? They can pretty much replicate a rollup, but there was one little thing where we still need to use rollups in Notion. And I just want to quickly mention that so you don't get confused why something won't work. You see, a very typical thing in Notion, right, is something called a self-referential dashboard. We have, for example, our projects, right? In our project, we then set up a template where we say, okay, new project. And here I want to create a linked view of the tasks that are connected with this, right? So I go tasks, and I say, okay, from this task filter, show me only the ones where the project is contained, connected to my new project here. And that now means, right, that if I go somewhere, for example, here Notion set up migration, I load in this template, and I will see only the tasks that are linked to this specific element. Now, the thing you'll notice is that I've done this via the relation. We can, of course, go one level further, right? We could say, okay, on tasks, right? Maybe on tasks, we want to see something that sits above the project, right? Let's say we have here, let's add a new thing in there. Let's say we have a database, and this database will be OKRs. Perfect. Let's quickly create this new table, OKR. Let's relate this to our projects. Here are our projects. A little bit confusing now with all these entries here. We have, OKR 1, and this belongs to some of our, like this very first project. What we can do now, of course, is we can use these self-referential relations one level further. Right? We can say, okay, on the task, right, new task, I would like to see the OKR. So create link view of database. And even though on tasks, right, I don't have, not tasks, I need to go to, create link view of database to the OKR. Even though we don't have a direct relation, we can still show it here by going to OKR and saying, okay, on OKR, where are we? On OKRs, I would like to have a roll-up for my tasks. So I go in here, I create a roll-up, and I say, tasks, and we pull in from projects my tasks. All right, and we're going to wrap this. On tasks, with the roll-up setup, I can now go in here and say, okay, OKRs, filter this OKR list for only the one where tasks, any, contains the new task template. Same idea, self-referential template. This will automatically show all the OKRs that have been linked to the project that this task is linked to. But this only works with the rollup, right? Even though we can currently replicate this look with, task formula by saying, oops, please go to projects and then from projects, map current.tasks, right? Show me all the tasks that are linked to this. Creates exactly the same look here, but if we go into this template picker, right, and we say, okay, actually let's switch this from our roller to our formula, we see, we don't have any picker. We can only hard code in values, which is of course not what we want, right? Because if any of the names change or so, that would not be great. So this is the one limitation where formulas and rollups, still fall apart in terms of functionality. As soon as Notion updates this and ships this, formulas can replace rollups pretty much altogether. Rollups are then just an easier way, right, to write formulas. But yeah, good to notice. It's sometimes something that you run into if you build more complex setups, particularly like we do for our clients. So best to keep that in mind. Now, before we move on to automations, I have a quick favor to ask. If you found this helpful so far, please subscribe to the channel and consider joining my Notion newsletter. There are already more than 30,000 Notion fans on it. Pretty insane. Over there, I share more tips, free templates, and a behind-the-scenes look as I'm building out Europe's #1 Notion consultancy. You'll find the link for all of this in the description. But now, let's continue first with automations. All right. I hope you are excited, because now that we've learned everything there is about Notion formulas, it's time to take things one step further and use automations. Because at the end of the day, formulas are amazing, but they have one sort of big drawback. Notion formulas can never influence any other property, right? Anything that we write in our formulas will only be relevant in this formula property or in other formula properties that reference it. We can't write a formula to say, well, if something happens, then please change that, right? So for example, let's say we have the current due date, right? This is today. We can of course now go in, right, and say formula, okay, overdue. And we can say, well, okay, if the due date, right, if that is smaller than today, right, then please check it, right? We want to see when it's overdue, right? And this task here is now due or like overdue, so we need to have it checked. But we can never ever go in and say, okay, if it's overdue, please set the priority to high, or please assign the responsible to me, right? We don't have sort of like actions inside formulas. In order to influence other properties in our Notion database, we need Notion automations. So this part of the video and this masterclass is all about how we can use these Notion database automations to influence, to update things in our setup. Now, there's one important caveat before we dive into this section of the video, and that is that currently, at the date of filming, Notion database automations are only available on paid plans. So in order to create your own database automations, you need to be either on a paid plan or on one of the sort of like paid plan equivalents, for example, the education plans, right, where you get a paid Notion plan for free. Otherwise, you can use Notion database automations that other template creators added to their templates, and you download them, right? But you won't be able to change them. So that's just something ahead of time, but still, right, it's very well worth to learn these concepts. And it's probably, if you need any of these automations, worth paying for Notion, because they can save you a ton of time. Before we get into details, we need to just quickly think about the general structure of any automation. And this is true whether you build Notion database automations or whether you work with any other kind of no-code tools, for example, make.com, relay.app, right? Zapier, they all follow one basic principle. There is a trigger, something that happens, and then there are actions, some things that will be changed or updated. So trigger refers to anything that happens in your Notion workspace that can launch a database automation. That can, for example, be the click of a button. It can be that a certain property changes to something, some actions that have happened. And then there are actions. Actions are things like, let's update a property, right? Or let's send a notification, let's send an email. And the thing is that whenever you build database automation, you will always be triggering them sequentially, right? The trigger happens, and then action 1 happens, action 2 happens, action, and so on, right? However many actions you add to it, they will all be executed one after the other. So basically, when it comes to database automations, there are two very big important limitations in any system. The first question is, well, what can be our triggers, right? That changes, and Notion over time will release more triggers, hopefully. And then there are actions, right? Like, what can we actually do once something has happened? Overall, Notion database automations are still in the early stages, right? They are by far not as robust as dedicated platforms like Make, Zapier, Relay. But they're still very, very helpful. So we're going to learn how they work. You can also then use this knowledge, right, to use other no-code automation tools. And as Notion releases more robust functionality for Notion database automations, you still have understood the foundational principles and can use that to build pretty much anything you want. So let's get going. Now, there are actually 3 ways to sort of trigger or create a Notion automation. The first one is through the flash icon here, by creating new automations. The second one is by adding a property, which is a button property. And the third one is to just add a button anywhere in your workspace. And this is the simplest one, so let's actually start with this. This is also actually one where I forgot. This is available on free plans as well, right? The other automations, the ones that trigger based on the database, this is available on paid plans. The button that is generally in your workspace, that is available everywhere. So let's add this button, and let's say, okay, click me, exclamation mark, that's the title for our button. We see it here, we can also add an icon, and then we see here our builder. When button is clicked, so the action is clear, right? With the button, you don't have a specific trigger, the trigger is always the button is clicked, do action. That's why it's a bit simpler, right? Because we don't need to bother with triggers yet. We can simply focus on the action side. So let's click on action and see what actions Notion gives us currently at the time of filming. We have insert blocks, add page to, edit pages, send a notification, send an email, send a webhook, show confirmation, open something, send a Slack notification, and define variables. Lots of options, so let's go over all of them. First up, insert blocks. That one is very self-explanatory, right? When we click here, we can say, okay, should we insert blocks above or below the button? And then whatever we write here in this complete Notion formula, complete Notion editor, will just be inserted. And this, you can think of this a little bit like a database template, right? On the Notion database, we can define this template. Every time we add a new entry to the database, it loads these blocks. This works exactly the same way. So I have headings, right? This is a heading. I have, just some text. And when I now close this button, right, and I will apply this and information will be applied. You also have access to some dynamic data by typing add. I see, okay, I can have, the time when it's duplicated. So whenever the button is clicked, that will be inserted. And I can have also remind specific people. But in this case, we want to say just, okay, let's say, for example, this could be very useful if we had like a running log, right? So for example, journal entry at today by, me. And now, just have something down there. I will click on done. And now if we click this button, happens exactly what we expect, right? We create this new journal entry at today by Matthias. I can, write something. And whenever I click this button again, I will add another entry below the button and above all the other things below it. And then, click me. Just add these things to the page. So let's go back to edit our button. For doing so, we hover over it and then click on this edit button. And here we see, we can add more actions, right? So we could do something that runs after it inserts these things. So we could, insert more blocks. But for now, let's just remove this action and look at the next option. The next option is to add a page to. And if we click on here, what it allows us to do is we can say, okay, we can add an entry to database. So for example, to our task database, we can add a new entry. And the second we select our database, it now allows us to give, the entry a name, right? So new task through button. We can edit a property. We can say, the due date should be set, for example. The due date should be set to, there's, for example, the date triggered time, right? So we can set it to now. And let's say the priority will be set to low and responsible. We can hard code it to a specific person or say whoever clicked this button. Perfect. So let's click on done. Let's take this button up here, right, above the database to see how it works. We say click me, and now we add a new task through button. Perfect. Has a current date and has me as responsible. Now, let's use and combine this with our newfound formula knowledge. Because what you'll see is here, there's this like edit as formula option. And also here, right, whenever you click into anything, you always have the option to use a custom formula. So, for example, we can say, I don't want to have today's date, right? I want to have always the task set for tomorrow. Now, tomorrow isn't available here. We can only pick like a fixed date or, when it has triggered. But by writing a formula, we can do that. So let's go in here, say custom formula, date triggered. How do we increase the date? With date add, right? So we say date add, increase it by 1 days. Perfect. Let's save this. Let's close our option and let's click the button again, right? The next task will be for February 1st. Amazing. This is how we can use now formulas to update the information in your database automations or button automations dynamically. Let's do another example. Go back to edit, say new task to button. I want to know who created this task, right? We have a responsible here, but still I want to know who's created this. So new, let's add it as a formula altogether. So go to edit as formula. And same experience as before, right? You can simply type all the strings that you want to insert here, but you also see in terms of properties, you see as one option is like whoever clicked this button. So we say new task by plus whoever clicked, right? Click and save, click on, scroll down here to done, click me, new task by Matthias. Perfect, that works. Let's continue with the next operator, and that is the edit pages option. Now, this is a dangerous one, so definitely make sure you practice here with some sample data, not your main databases. Let me show you what I mean. So let's say edit databases. Okay, we select the database, tasks, and by default it says edit all pages and tasks. Now, for example, we'll say, well, I want to edit the task name. And I'll just click on done, right? And now innocently run this. What you'll see is it overwrites all my names. And unless I find, this undo button here in time, I just deleted sort of all my entries. That's not good. So two things. We want to always make sure that we set a filter to say what entries we actually want to edit. And then we probably don't want to have an empty thing, right? We probably don't want to overwrite something. So let's, for example, let's say we want to edit only the overdue tasks. We want to say, okay, everything where the due date is before today. On these tasks, please don't edit the task name, please edit due date, and let's edit the due date to, custom formula to, just let's edit to tomorrow, right? Like a date add 1 days. So after that, we don't have any overdue tasks anymore. Perfect, easy solution to not being able to finish them. So we click this and we expect that this one here, which is on January 30th, right, will update to Feb 1. Click me, and then in a moment, perfect. Feb 1, we even get the time, right? We put the time in there. So we might want to update this to, instead of, like doing now, just saying today, but the general idea works. So let's go over the other actions a bit quicker. We'll talk about them more in more detail later, but just want to quickly raise how they work, right? So send notification to allows you to specify people in your workspace and then write a dynamic message to them, right? So a button was clicked, and just the same way as previously, where we can say by, me to get some dynamic data in there. We can use a formula right here to say button was clicked by plus whoever clicked. And then we can select our person, right? So let's say I want to notify Matthias. Click on this. And now if I click this button, right, I will get a new thing here in my inbox. Click me. And in a moment, we'll have this tick up to 30 because I have been notified. Next action, send email, right? Here, very simple. You select an account from which you want to send an email. And then you can also specify here the message that you want to send to the person, similar to that Notion notification. Next action is send webhook. We'll talk about this later, but this is a very good option to trigger third-party automations, right? So if you say, okay, I want to do something, but the Notion database automations are not robust enough. I need Make, I need Zapier, but I need to know based on something that happened in Notion when to run this automation. This is your best friend, right? This will be able to trigger something elsewhere. Show confirmation allows you to ask a security step, right? So let's say before someone edits all the pages in Notion, right? Before we say edit pages in, we have our task database, and before we set everything to a blank task name, are you sure you want to continue? Yes, that's definitely a good question to ask. So we will click this, and now we get this message. And if we click on cancel, it will abandon the rest of the automation run. And you can of course customize, right, what it says. So this is show confirmation. Then we have, edit pages in. Then we have next the open page. This is very useful, right? Either as navigation, so you can just use it standalone, and you can say, please open a certain page, right? Let's say I want to open my project management overview in full page. And now if someone clicks the button, it just behaves like a navigation button on a website. Alternatively, you will use this a lot when you add entries to a database, right? So previously, remember, we added a page to our task database. We said add a new entry to tasks, new task. Oftentimes when we do this, we want to be able to edit it directly because our button might not be on the same page as the database. So in order to make sure that we can then easily afterwards see that something has been added and then edit it, we want to make sure that we have this first in our automation, add page to tasks. And then when we say we want to open, we can say open the page that has been added and add it inside peek, right? That's my favorite way to do this. And now if we click it, we add this entry and we open it here so I can edit it and change any other options. Very good for UI, in particular if you work with teams, right? You always want to make sure that if you add an entry to a database, you open it afterwards so that people know something happened, right? They are not confused, well, did the button click actually do something? For the next one, this is send Slack notification to. And it is a built-in connection from Notion to Slack, right? So if you have authorized Notion with Slack, if not, like it will pop up here that you need to connect it. And then you can select your Slack channel and then you can say, okay, in projects, I want to send a message. But there's one big issue with this, and you see it already here, right? It simply says notify this channel. There are no customization options, right? I can't click on here and say, well, this is the message that it should send. I can't pull in any data. So this is something that I would actually not recommend using. I will show you later how you can use Notion automations to send custom notifications to Slack where you have full control over the content. Just know there is an option to do this, but it will send a very generic message. And yeah, since it can't be customized, I really don't like that option. The last action that we have available is to define a variable. And even though it's the last one, it's probably one of the most powerful ones and one that we're going to use a lot when we do more powerful automations. For now, all you need to know is that this step basically allows you to define a variable, right? So you can give this a name, let's call this var, and then we can hard code a value, right? We can just say, okay, my variable should be 1, if for whatever reason you always need access to that, or we can use a formula. And that's where the magic will later happen, because we can then reference certain elements from the trigger of the automation, define it as a variable, and use that to then inform later other action steps, right? So the second I have defined a variable here, in my other actions, so for example, when I say, add a page to, select database, let's save 2 tasks, right? We see now that if I open my formulas, I have my variable that I have defined previously here accessible, right? So this is really, really cool because it unlocks a lot of very useful workflows, but you need to see them in action. So for now, let's just keep it at that. Now, most of the time, these basic Notion buttons have 4 use cases for you in your system. You can use them for navigation, you can use them to add pages with quick actions, you can mass update data with caution, and you can modify page data. That's pretty much what the automations unlock here. So it's very simple automations, but still helps us with the UI. As an example, right, here's a marketing landing page for a team in a bigger company. And one thing that we can do here very nicely is we can use these buttons, right, as UI elements to quickly help people navigate around the website. We could, of course, right, also use standard links, but buttons sometimes are just like a nicer visual element than a lot of text. Very simple to do so, right? You simply use the open page module, and when you use them as navigation, you always want to make sure that you open the page as a full page, right? So that it really feels like, okay, you're jumping from one element to another. Another advantage is that you can, with buttons, right, it has the same look whether the button goes to an internal page in Notion or to an external page, right? For example, this one goes to a website, and that's very nice. One other trick that you can do with this, open page in feature is to actually open a Notion form, right? So for request design, if we click on this, we actually open a Notion form, and that makes it just, again, then very easy for people to fill out some information. So that's one of probably the best use cases for your Notion buttons. For option 2, right, adding pages to something, that's basically your quick action selection. So if you want to allow users in your system or yourself, right, to quickly add things without having to go to a database, these buttons are just great. So here on my personal dashboard, right, on a manager dashboard, we have a bunch of things, right? We have my system, and it shows me my projects, tasks, and docs, and then I see the same things for my team, right? So I can quickly check what they're working on. And if I need to add something new, right, rather than having to go to my system, tasks, and then click on new here, I can simply hit the new task button. And we use the add page to step, right, in combination with open a newly added page in the side tab. So I have this UI effect of quickly being able to edit, add an element, and then update it, right? So just if we inspect it, just like you saw it before, right? Add tasks to task as empty, set me as responsible, right? As the person who clicked, and then let's open this page in the side peek. Very simple Notion automation, but one that you're going to use all the time. Buttons can be nice also to mass update information, but again, right, this is something where you need to be very, very careful because it's very easy to just mess up your data altogether. So one example where it can be quite useful is to say, well, I want to be able to reset my due dates. Yeah, we know the situation. Sometimes we added due dates to tasks to the best of our intentions, but then they just didn't happen. And now rather than just dragging this like selection of tasks with like hundreds of due dates in the past with us, we can have a button, right, where we say, for example, okay, let's reset everything with a due date in the past to tomorrow, right? Maybe we'll make some more granular rules, right? We just clean out the due date so you can reassign it. We could also do this if you use typically time blocking, right? And if you want at the end of the week, you want to make sure that all open tasks, if they had a DO date, right, a due date, you want to clean that due date out so you can reblock them again. So lots of options where you want to mass update things, but again, need to be careful. The way how we want to set this up is usually with the 2-step, right? We want to show a confirmation just so we don't accidentally click it and edit all the information. And then we want to make sure that we set a granular filter. So in this case, what I'm saying is, okay, please edit all pages where the due date is before today. This is probably too wide, right? But for this example, it works quite well. In another example, right, what you probably would want to add to this, right, is and the status of this task, which we don't even have in this database, right? And the status of it is not done. Because of course we only want to update entries, that are still open and that we still need to modify. And then we can click on done, right? And then in this case, we see now in a second all these due dates that are in the past will update to tomorrow. So I click this here, I confirm here, and now we see everything has been set to February 16th. So works really, really well in these situations, but again, be careful. Another situation, right, where you might want to add this button is something where you want to mass assign tasks to you. So in a team setting, for example, this can be very useful. If you say, okay, I'm the team lead, right, and I need to assign all tasks that are overdue to me, or I need to assign everything that is high priority to me, then that is a very easy button to build in order to do that. But I would always make sure that you A, test it with some sample data, B, use a confirmation step so you don't accidentally update things, and then C, triple check the filter that you set here so you don't, mess up your information altogether. Now, the last use case of updating specific page data is actually sort of a bridge step to our next topic, which are database buttons. If you have a page that lives in a database, right? So this one doesn't live in a database. This is just a regular page, right? That is nested inside my YouTube container page. So here we don't have that situation. But the second we open a page that lives in a database, right? So it has our properties here, and we add now a button to the page body, you'll see one new thing. Let's just call this set to done. We see that when the button is clicked, we have a new action, and now we have Notion just moved yesterday the UI. So when you watch this video, it might be back out here, because actually I think it would be better out here. It used to be that we have an option here now that is called edit page details. Now you need to click on edit pages in, and then where it says select database, you see this page as an option. So just know, right, that there might be, when you watch this video, a slightly different UI. But basically, if you have a button inside a page that belongs to a database, then you have options with the button to update only the specific page on which you clicked the button, which makes sense, right? So let's click on this page, and now we see, right, when we edit a property, we could, for example, say set status to done. And this is sort of the counterpart to the edit step that we just saw, right? Here, this button outside, here we need to set a filter for the whole database, and we'll update every single page for which that filter is true. However, on this button, it will always only apply this action to, well, the page on which it has been clicked. So if I click this now, right, we will set the status to done. But if I check another task, right, this of course has not been started. But if I add the same button, right, if I just copy this quickly, should have done this in a template, but oh well. If I add this here now, right, and we click again this button to set to done, we also set it here to done. Again, this can be a really nice UI feature, right, to help when you build this either for yourself or for your team to sort of systematize certain actions that you would take in properties, so you don't have to scroll up, because these buttons can be anywhere on the page, right? If you have like a very long one, for example, let's say you have you use Notion to organize certain blog articles. You could have very long blog articles, and the very bottom of the page could be a button to approve the document. And so the person who's supposed to review it reads through it, and at the very bottom, they have then this button to approve it. Very neat and simple. Another way could be, right, to add buttons to, set this specific task for today. Or if you use a wiki and you want to allow people to highlight that information has been outdated, right? Having a button at the top of wiki documents to alert the responsible person that this is outdated is a very good idea. You can actually add to this, right? Let's use our first example where we do something a little bit more complicated. Let's assume this is not a task, right? But it is one of these wiki pages, and we want to make sure that we set it to, needs review because it has been outdated. So I just added myself here as responsible, and now we can do this, right? So let's update this button. Let's call it, notify, or mark as outdated. And then we could add, a confirmation step is here, are you sure you want to mark this as outdated? If you work in a team environment, that would be a good idea, right? You always want to have people confirm actions before they take them. And what we would then do is, okay, we want to first make sure that we edit this page, and we set the status to needs review, same idea as before. And now we add another action, and we say we want to send a notification, right? We want to select a notification, and now the really cool thing is, rather than just like selecting, specific people that always get notified, we can use the person property on this database, right? Because if this was a wiki database, it should also always have responsible. Every document needs an owner, right? So we can notify that owner when it is outdated. So we say, okay, send notification to a person property. That property will be the responsible one. And let's say here in the message, now that we want to, notify them that it has been outdated. Again, this message can now either be standardized, right? A document is outdated, but that would not be very good from a UI perspective. So rather, let's personalize it with the information that we have. So let's first say, tell the person who gets notified who did that, right? So let's type add and say, well, we want the person who clicked, right? Just marked, and now we will type add again. And from this page, we wanna grab the here it's task name because it's the wrong database, but whoever clicked, just mark this page name as outdated. Please double check. right? Which is a much better notification than this generic one, because now I know exactly who I need to contact if I'm, like, this is not outdated, or to tell them that it has been updated. And I also see exactly what it is about, right? Maybe this has been on my to-do list already. So much easier to do so. And now, right, when I click this as mark as outdated, we see this gets to needs review, and I have here in my inbox another notification as the person who has been set as responsible. This brings us then to our second type of automation triggers, Notion database buttons. Just like buttons in Pages, right, we can add a button to a specific database as a property. So in order to do so, right, we can use any way to create a new property. So for example, click on plus and then looking for the button option. Now this button generally behaves just like the button we just saw, right? We can give it as a title. So let's say, click me. By default, it will then start taking this also as the name for the button here, right? We can change the icon as for any property, and then we can edit the automation that is attached to this. Now if I click here, right, you see, first of all, I can now rename the thing here, right? So like a different name. If you want to have the name of, your property different from the name of the button, that is possible, but you need to go through this extra step. And then the trigger is, of course, always, again, button is clicked. And for the actions, it works now exactly the same as for our other buttons, with the one specific part, right, that whenever you click on edit pages in, you'll have the option to edit this page, or in case Notion decides to move the UI out again, right, you will have just like an additional option outside there where it says edit page details. The thing about this, right, is that it's very, very useful to sort of wrap up certain actions for the user, either for yourself or for your team. So just the way that we saw it with the page, the buttons within a database page, this is pretty much the same, right? So for example, we could use this to say, okay, assign this to me, right? So let's call this assign to me. And as the action, what we want to do is whenever this is clicked, we want to make sure that we edit the property. Actually, you see, here it is. Here we still have it outside and inside. These options used to be also for the other one available. Here they haven't moved the UI yet, so it is a bit confusing sometimes, but I'm sure when you click in it, you'll be able to figure out where that is located. So here we have also edit property. And here you see right now I have access to all the property information from this specific row. And I could say now, okay, when this is clicked, I want to make sure that the responsible, and now I can choose, right? I could add myself to it, or I can replace, which in this case I want to do. I want to replace that with whoever clicked this button. All right, so now I can click on save, right? And then in any database property, right, if I click on this, it will make sure that it assigns this task to me, which is very nice, right? Because you can, of course, then place this button in a location that makes sense. For example, you can combine these database buttons with a new Notion layout builder. So if we go here and open this, right, and say we want to customize the layout, we want to make sure that we first move all our properties over to the panel, right? Then we pin our 2-3 most important ones, so responsible, priority, and due date. And then here in the sidebar, one thing that we can do is we can add a new section. So we can say, these are my standard properties. And then I can have a specific section for my quick actions. And under these quick actions, right, I'm going to add now the, not priority, but the click me button. And then I can apply this to all pages. And now whenever we open a specific page, right, we have here in the sidebar then our whole section of quick actions available to for the user to quickly, do certain things. Assigned to me, of course, fairly straightforward, but you might have a range of things, right? You might say, okay, maybe we need to reset a due date here, right? With a similar approach to previously, right? We just set a due date to today. We could change the priority, whatever basically mass updates you want to do to certain properties in this database could be done here. You could also move the mark as outdated button that we created previously now into this database, because it works just the same way, right? So let's create another button. Let's say, okay, mark outdated question mark, and then say for automation, okay, when this is clicked, right, we want to make sure that we set edit property, set the status to needs review, and then as a second step, add our notify option. Now we have our 2 buttons right here, and people can quickly take these actions. One really fun use case for these Notion database buttons is to build an upvote or downvote system, right? So you could do that for an internal forum, or in this case, for some example, to pick which team retreat activity you want to do, right? So I run a Notion consultancy, and we have now started to build an actual team. So when we meet in person, we want to figure out, okay, what is it that we do? In order to do so, right, I've created a database with a few activities that we could do. And now in order to let people vote, I'm going to first create a person property, right? And we call this votes. Then I'm going to create a property with our button, right? So I'm going to add a button, vote, exclamation mark, or upvote. And the action will be whenever this is clicked, what we want to do is we want to edit a property. We want to edit the votes, and we don't want to replace, we want to add the person who clicked to this property. And then we can click on save. So now that means I can click on the button, right, and upvote it. And then what I want to do is I want to count number of votes. So for that, we're going to create a formula property. And you know the drill, right? That was from the first part of our tutorial. Here, we will now reference, the number of votes and say, okay, how do we count a people property? Well, a people property is an array. So all we need to do is we need to take votes and say dot length. And this gives me the number of people who have upvoted something. So if I now click on here, right, this is one person. If I click here, it's one person. If someone else right clicks it, they will, it will add their one as well. And of course, the benefit of the system is that people can't multiple vote, right? Even if I click here 10 times, I'm still only here once. Whereas if you use this button to increment it, right, that would be another setting that we could do. We could say, okay, instead of this, let's increment the other property. Then they could vote several times. Just to show you how this would work, right? If we want to build a button that you can just click to increment things, let's go back to our settings. And let's say, well, we want to edit this page. This is correct. But this time we want to edit the different property. Where is it? We want to edit our number of votes. Sorry, 1 second. Gotta double check why this doesn't work. Let's go back to edit automation. Maybe we need to just refresh the page. That sometimes does the trick. Because usually we should have access here also to this. Oh no, we actually don't have it because it's a formula property. My bad. So I was slightly confused for a second. But of course, since this is a formula property, we can't edit it. So instead, we would need to add a num property, some live troubleshooting here, and say, okay, when we click our vote button, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we take our number and we increment it by 1. So in order to increment it, right, we first need to get the current value, which means we can't just type 1 in here. We need to write a formula. And this is now another example, right, where our lessons from Notion formulas are starting to tie in with Notion automations. Because very often when we build more advanced Notion automations, we want to be able to reference dynamic data, and we do that through formulas. So let's click on edit as a formula. Now we can say, okay, from this page, I want you to grab the votes, the number, that's the property that we want to grab, and we want to do +1, right? This is our formula. Whatever the current number is, incremented with 1. Let's click on save. And now if I click on vote, right, we go to 1, we go to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Whenever I click this button, it counts 1 up. So very simple vote generator. Of course, with this one, you don't really have then a check of who upvoted, right? You definitely allow people to click this several times. And if for whatever reason, that's what you want to allow them to do, but you still want to figure out, well, who clicked the button, you could now make this even more complicated. And now, just for the sake of it, right, we could add a text property and say, vote log, and say, okay, whenever the button is clicked, and this is incremented, record who clicked it. So let's update our button. Same idea as before. And we added a second property. We added our vote log. And here we now say, okay, my formula here will be, again, this page dot vote log. And then what we want to add is we want to add a new line character to it. As you remember from previously, the new line character, right, is this like slash backslash n. And then we say, okay, plus the whoever clicked the button. Right, so now if we save this and save here, we can click this and we increment and we say, okay, Matthias, right? This doesn't wrap currently, but once it wraps, we have them on new lines. So now we have an, a log of, okay, who clicked the button and why did they click it? We could, of course, expand it, right? We could add to when they clicked and so on. But of course, for this like vote button, it's probably not the most useful of features. We are, however, going to use the same approach a bit later in this video when we talk about the standard Notion database automations, the one that gets triggered by creating them here. When we want to build a log of updates to our due date, right? Because this might be quite a useful situation where we want to record, okay, whenever a due date has been changed, well, who changed it and from what, to just be able to follow that historically. Another great exercise to understand these Notion database buttons is to build a little time tracker in Notion. We can do actually quite some decent time tracking directly in it, right? Without any other tool, thanks to this combination of Notion automations with formulas. So our setup for this should be our task database. And then if we want a very simple time tracking, we could just add our two properties here, right? We could just say, okay, date, start date and end date, and then we could just update those. But actually, let's take a look at a little bit of a more robust one. For the more robust one, what we want to do, right, in particular, if we want to be able to track several work sessions for an individual task, we want to create a secondary database called time entries. And here we have our start time, our end time, and then we have the relation to tasks. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to build a database button. So let's actually just go in here, right, and go on to properties. Let's hide them all for a moment. I don't want to see any of them. Let's create a new button and let's call this start tracking. And what we want to do here is whenever we click this button, right, what we want to do is we want to add a page. We want to add a page to our time entries. And this time entries one will be entry for, and then we can dynamically reference the task, right, where this happened by either going to formula or just typing directly here add, and we can say, this page, the task name, or we can just link it to it if we wanted to as well. But let's just go to this page and then the task name. And then what we want to do is we want to, of course, also set the start time to the time when we trigger this. That's our 2 steps. And the last one, sorry, one very important one, we need to also relate it, right? We need to make sure that this new time entry is related to the page where we clicked it from, right? So this page. These are our 3 steps, which means now, if I click this button anywhere, right, start tracking, we add this new entry here, entry for create automation workflow, right? We have our start time. It is linked to this. And now I can create a second button. And for the second button, I can say, okay, let's make sure that we stop the tracking. So we add button and we call this, stop tracking, edit automation. And here we will say, okay, new action. We want to now update pages, right? We want to update everything that is related with this specific task. And this is now where we finally will use variables for the first time. Because what you'll see is when we go to, edit pages in, we can select our time entries, but in our filters, we don't have access to any dynamic information, right? So we can't say, okay, edit everything where the relation to task contains, this page that we just used, right? These are all hard-coded values. And that's, of course, what we want to do, because we want to update the pages, the timed entries that are related to this specific page. So how do we solve this? Well, what we do is we make sure that we have a variable defined first. So let's go to delete this. And let's say new action, define variable. And let's call this, entries. And then here we can go into the formula and we can say, give me from this page the related time entries. This is the workaround that allows you to update only certain related information with an entry by clicking or triggering a database automation. If this feels a little bit complicated, don't worry, because it is. This is probably one of the most complex things that you can do with Notion database automations right now. Hopefully it gets easier in the future, but we'll go over this again in a second to step by step. Just want to finish this quickly off so you see how it all ties together. Let's click on save. And let's say, okay, let's add another action. And now let's say edit pages in. And when we do this now, one option that we have is rather than, editing everything in time entries, we can edit simply our variable, right? So let's edit our variable, which are all the tasks that are related to this entry, and say, okay, what we want to do is we want to set the end time for something. Now we want to set the end time, right, to the time triggered. And then we can click on save. Now, I just realized there's a mistake so far with the automation. You'll notice this in a second. But when we click now on stop tracking, right, that means we set our entry time here to the end time, right? So here now it fills in 9:56. Perfect. Now the issue, of course, if you noticed, is that currently we updated for all related entries, right? So if I have another entry here, right, in a moment, it will actually update both of them to a new time. And that's, of course, not what we want to happen. So we need to fix this quickly. And in order to do so, we have a few options. We could set a status here, right? We could say something, let's add, a select here, and let's call this status, and let's give it 2 options. And let's say, like running and stopped. And then we can say, okay, whenever we start the tracking, we actually want to modify this button because we want to make sure that we set the status to running. And then when we click on stop tracking, we only want to, fill the end time for entries where the status is running. So how do we do this? Well, we modify our variable. We go back to the formula and we don't want to convert this. We go back to our formula. Here, that's how we do it. And we want to make sure that we only pick time entries where the timer is running. How do we do that? Well, previous lessons, right? Formulas. How do we select only some of an array? Well, we do this with filter. So dot filter. We want to only pick the ones where current dot status equals running. And that way, we will not select any of the entries, right, where the timer has already been stopped, so we don't overwrite any information. So now that means, right, let's set this here, right, to stopped. But let's pretend that this one is still running, right? We can also click in and clear the time. And now when we click on stop tracking, it should only update the time for the one that is still running, right, and not for the one that has been already finished. Last step that's missing, right, we need to make sure that we update the status as well when we do this. So let's go back to the automation, and as another step, say here, edit property status, let's set this to stopped. And with this system, you've built a very simple time tracking module. The only thing that's missing here is to make sure that you actually count that time. And that, with the help of formulas, right, is no problem for you at this point. So let's just go through the motions, new formula, and let's call this one duration. We're going to use our date between operator to get the time from the end time and the start time. And we're going to get this in minutes. We can go and save. And now we have here, right, 2 minutes and 3 minutes. And then we can use another formula up here to get the sum of that, or roll up, right, does the same trick. The formula total time spent will be, okay, formula will be, we go to our time entries and we use our map function, right, to get from every value the duration. And then we want to get the sum of it. Pretty much a summary, right, of what we did previously with our formulas. We click on save, and now we see, okay, we spent 5 minutes on this task, right? And if we keep time tracking now, it will keep increasing and incrementing. So pretty cool, right, what you can do with now your newfound knowledge of Notion database buttons plus Notion formulas from the previous one. You can build this time tracking system and don't need any third-party tools. You can make this more robust, right? But this is the gist. It doesn't really get much more complicated than this. Let's build another example, because again, right, this is a little bit complicated of how we can update only certain related entries with Notion database automations. In this example, we have now added projects to our system, right? We have still our tasks, and now we have projects, and certain tasks are related to these projects. And one thing that we want to have maybe on project is we want to be able to, whenever we click this button, we might want to either update the status, right, or change the due date, right? Maybe something where, okay, let's set now the due date for everything, or let's make me responsible for everything. Whatever it is, right, we want to mass update all tasks related to this specific project. So how do we do this? Well, we add a database button, right, because we want to be able to trigger it based on this specific entry. And we'll call this, start tasks. And the automation will be that we want to go in and all tasks that have not been completed yet, let's set this also to completed, all tasks that are not yet completed should be set to in progress. All right, let's tackle this. The first thing that we need to do, right, as previously, is we need to grab all the related tasks. Remember, in the previous step with the variable, we need to tell Notion, okay, you need to handle everything that is related to it. And we do that by clicking on new action and then saying, well, define variables. And we're going to call this tasks. And our formula here is going to be this page dot and then tasks, right? Whatever our relation is. And just as previously, we don't actually want to grab all tasks, right? We only want to edit tasks that are not completed yet. So we again do dot filter and say only grab the tasks where the current status is not done, right? Only those tasks should be loaded into our variable. Let's click on save. And then we can add another action. And now we can say again, edit pages in. And we have again now available our variable here. So tasks. So let's edit all the tasks, right, that we've grabbed in this previous step and say, okay, for all of them, I would like to set the status to in progress. Click on save. And now when we click this, right, it shouldn't change anything for the tasks that are already done. But for these two ones that are related, right, not all tasks are actually connected to it, right? So let's show the project just so we see that it works as intended. If we click this button, these two should update. So let's click it. And there we have it, right? It worked perfectly. It grabbed only these two entries, none of the others. And that's how you, tie in relations with variables into your automations. All right, now you're ready to upgrade to the last and final level of Notion database automations. And those are the ones that you create directly on the database level itself with this flash icon. Just to recap, right? We so far saw two other ways to create database automations, just adding a button anywhere or adding a button to a page. And now this third level is the most complex one, but also the one with the most flexibility. Because for the first time, we'll have now additional triggers. Right here, our only trigger is always that, well, someone clicks the button. So you also need a manual action. With these ones, you're actually, taking it one step further and you can do things without someone clicking the button. The actions will stay the same. So that's good, right? We don't need to learn anything new there, but now we need to look at different triggers. So let's do exactly that. Let's click on our flash icon and let's call this, first automation. We're going to ignore this here for a second because it adds another layer that we look at in a moment. And then we see now that for the first time, we cannot just select actions, but we can also select triggers. So what triggers are currently available here? Well, if we click here, we see we have an event where we say any property that is edited, a new page has been added, or every XXX. And then if we scroll further, right, we have actually a selection of properties. So let's add 2-3 more properties here. And let's add status property here, status, and let's add due date here, or like a date that we can call the duration, just so we have a few properties, duration, and person property as responsible. Perfect. Let's go back to our automation and see now under new triggers, right? We see now all these properties that we have here popping up down there below as well. Basically, this means we can trigger an automation either when any property on a database is edited or when a specific property is edited, right? So here it will just trigger whenever something changes. And then for the other ones, it will update when one of these specifically is changed, right? So we could say, okay, whenever the responsible is changed, right? Any change to responsible, I want you to edit a property. I want you to rename this, name has changed. And like responsible was changed, and I use the time triggered. Okay, done. Doesn't make much sense, right, to set this in as a name of the project, but just so you get the gist, right? I go in here now, I added this property as a responsible. That is actually me, and in a moment we will rename project A to, this has been changed by me. Responsible was changed February 15th, 2025. So that's a pretty straightforward trigger. Let's look at the other ones, right? If we go back, we can go back to our automation and we can click on edit. And make sure that this time we delete this trigger, and instead we say, okay, my trigger should now be page edit. This one is even simpler, right? This just means, okay, whenever we add a new page, we do something. What should we do? Well, whenever we, change this, we actually could set the name automatically, right? We could say, okay, let's edit the name. This project was created at time triggered by, person who whoever triggered it. All right. Not the most useful one, right? But still shows you what it does. So we click on add new page, right? We haven't given it a name. And in a moment, once the automation runs, which is usually within 10 to 30 seconds latest, we'll see that it will fill out the name by who created it and why. Now this can come in very handy, and we have a use case in a moment to like auto name entries in, your database. But let's just look at the last trigger for now. And that is the option to say, okay, not just when something happens, but regularly, right? Every X, right? So I can say every frequency, and I can say every day, weekday. So I have here access to the same repeating options that I have also for database templates, right? In case you don't know, it's not technically an automation in that same sense. But if we had a template on this, right, a new project, we could say, okay, please apply this new project template every X, right? So we can repeat and say, okay, every day, create a new project, right? For projects, it's not too relevant, but for example, if you have a journal and you want to say, okay, every day give me a new journal entry, this can be quite handy. And we have this same option now, since very recent for automations, that we can say, okay, whenever, well, let's move this, like every day, let's, and then here we need to then of course have a different action. Let's add a page to this database, probably, right? We could add it to any database, but just to keep, your automations clean, you probably want to add it only to pages, to databases that you actually run this on, and say, okay, like new daily entry, and then click on that. This, of course, we now can't showcase, right? Because it will take a day for this to trigger, but you get the idea. Now that we have our triggers covered, let's take a look at a few use cases. This first one is very simple, but it shows you beautifully how you can use these Notion database automations to, just reduce unnecessary clicks. Here we have fictional bug reports for my Notion ROI calculator, which is a little tool, right, that you can find online that helps you to calculate like how soon is the investment, or like how much money can you save by switching to Notion. And here we have some fictional reports, right? Calculator starts mining cryptocurrency when idle. Of course, that's not good. So we need to fix this. Now we know, right, that based on the type of a bug that it has, we need to assign a specific person, right? For example, for AI rebellion, that will always be Matthias who has to handle it. Now, what we can do, right, is when the person who gets these bug reports, who has to then, now triage and categorize them, they could, of course, click twice, right? They could say, okay, this here is an AI rebellion issue and Matthias has to solve it. But if Matthias has to solve this every single time, right, then this is just unnecessary work. So instead of doing this, what we can do is we can set a database automation and can say, okay, set responsible for AI revolution. I want to always give it a specific name and say, okay, when a property is edited, and not any property, but if the type is edited, right? And if the type is set to a specific one, right? If the type is set to AI rebellion, then what I want you to do is I want you to take an action and I want you to edit another property. I want you to set Matthias as the responsible person. And we can click on enable. So now when we set the type here to AI rebellion and the type here to AI rebellion, it will automatically in a moment assign Matthias here as the responsible person. Super useful, right? Not just for these categorizations of types. You can of course also use this with priority. For example, if the priority of something is high, make sure to assign the team lead, right? Or if you, for example, have a series of, like for example, let's say you have content production, right? And you use a status property to track things from idea to ultimately, the production. You could say, okay, when it is, the status is set to ready for production or like ready to be edited, assign the editor as the responsible person and so on. So you can reduce the amount of clicks you have to do when you update data in your database. Now there are two cool other, sort of angles to this type of automation that I just want to quickly run by you. The first one is that this initial categorization of what type or what priority it is doesn't have to happen by a human, right? You can use AI to do this for you. So if you have Notion AI, one thing that you can do, which is really useful in these situations, is to turn on AI autofill. What AI autofill will do is, if it's on a select property, is that AI will, based on your instructions, figure out which tag best fits this, right? So we can say here, AI autofill, let's turn this on. We can allow it to generate new options, although usually you don't want this to happen, right? Usually you want to predefine your categories and then say, okay, based on these, select the one that fits best. And then, which I would always recommend, is you can customize your prompt, right? You can now tell it, okay, if X, right, these are the rules by which you should, apply tags, right? You can also make sure that, for example, if you know that will always get wrong X, right, that you specifically instructed to do it, we can leave this empty here because we don't want to do it, right? We just have the general example. But basically, it will now, whenever something new comes in, right, it will automatically go in and fill that property. And that will trigger the automation, right? So if you say now autofill this, right, and autofill that, and I actually just updated the automation to run whenever this is updated, right, just to make sure that we see that it gets triggered, right? So I changed it to whenever the type is set to anything, then please set me as responsible, and you see it triggers off that. So you can have an input, right? User reports it back. You have an AI who pre-filters it, and then you have an automation automatically based on who, what type it is. It automatically gets assigned to the right person or the right team, which is a really, really cool workflow to cut down on this manual triage time. The second option that you have here is to use a Notion form and let the user actually define, right, the types themselves. So here I just set up a simple form, right? Bug description and the type. Very important, I removed the AI component because as long as a data property is set to AI autofill, users can't fill it out with a form. But when I remove it, they can fill it out again. Right now, they can pick what is the type that describes the bug best. And then when they fill out the form, right, and add someone there, our automation will also run and automatically figure out, well, who is the best person who should be responsible for this. Pretty neat. Moving on to another use case, these database automations are really useful when it comes to project management and keeping things in sync. Let's say, for example, we have our projects, right? And remember, we had previously this button that we need to click to say, okay, let's start these tasks. Of course, this button click is nice, but oftentimes, right, this would again mean two things. We need to first set the status of this project to in progress and then click a button to launch the tasks. But with the other automation trigger, we can actually just roll this up into one step. And we can say, okay, whenever we start a project, we want to make sure that we start all tasks that belong to it. So let's do this. Let's go here to create and view automations, and we will set a new automation. And we say, okay, whenever, set tasks to in progress. Highly recommend that you give your automations very clear names of what they do. And then we say new trigger. All right, when we edit the status of a project and when we set this to in progress, what I wanted to do is I want to update all tasks that are related to it. So new action. First, define variables, right? Same process as before. Just because our trigger is different doesn't mean our action updates much. And we say here tasks. And we say as a formula, right, let's just use a simple one in this case. Let's say everything from trigger page, right, this is here still our important option, trigger page dot tasks. We want to take just all tasks, right? No filter this time. And we want to make sure that we edit pages in this task relation. And we want to set their status to in progress. Again, of course, right, for your production automation, you would make sure that you set the filter accordingly to whatever it is you need, right, that you don't want to accidentally overwrite tasks that have already been completed. But we set this now to in progress. And then in a moment, our tasks here will also all update to in progress. And then, while we're waiting for this to happen, we can already talk about the corresponding action, right? What we want to make sure happens as well is that when we maybe start a single task of this of a project, we want to actually launch the project, right? So we want to make sure that when the first person starts working on a task, we update all the projects that belong to that. And we haven't, the automation hasn't come through yet, but sometimes again, right, it takes a second. You can also inspect it actually to see whether something went wrong, right? If you click on this, if something would have gone wrong here, we would see now here an issue. Oops, actually, I realized the issue. This is the one that we need to set to the progress, otherwise we can wait for forever. But still, a good note that we'll talk about in a second as well is if your automations go wrong, you will see here a little alert and why it went wrong. All right, so now we have the in progress status here as we wanted to. Let's set them all back, right? Let's make sure status is all back to not started. And also here we set this back to not started. And let's build the corresponding automation for the way back. Let's say here, okay, start project. When any task, right? When task status is set to the in progress step, let's make sure that we take the project. So again, define variable, right? Even if it's only one in the relation, we need to use that to grab it. Say formula trigger page dot project, and let's then say add action, edit pages in projects, and set the status here to in progress. And then let's click on enable. Now, if I click here on any of my automations, right, so and say, okay, this has now been in progress, you'll see in a second that this status over here for my project also updates. What is even more important than what is happening, though, is what is not happening. Because did you notice something? These other three tasks are not set to in progress, even though based on our logic, they should be, right? Because remember, we have here an automation that says, well, when the project status is set to in progress, update all tasks that belong to it. And even though with this automation, right, we updated the status here, it did not then trigger this other automation to update the other tasks. Now, this is a very important limitation with Notion automations right now. And it's important that you understand, because there will be a lot of situations, right, when we run into this and you wonder, well, why didn't it do what I told it to do? And that is that you currently cannot chain database automations. A database automation cannot trigger another database automation. Notion built this in to avoid loops, right? Because otherwise you could accidentally build something like, okay, whenever a page is added to projects, add a page to tasks, and whenever a page is added to tasks, add a task to projects. So it's very easy, right, to build an infinite loop of things updating each other, and then, until Notion, can figure out a good way to avoid this for users, they just outright block it altogether. So what does this mean? Well, it means that all these triggers on a database automation will only be fired by a manual user action, or a third-party automation, or an AI action. So let's go through all of these in order. The first thing is, of course, obvious, right? If I set this now back to not started, and then wait a moment, and then I set this to in progress, in a moment my automation will fire and will update these three properties. So far, so good. The second situation, right, a third-party automation works as well. So if you use a tool like Make, Zapier, or Relay to, trigger any action in your database and change the status of this to in progress, well, this also counts, right? So you can automate the trigger of another Notion database automation, but it needs to be an external automation, not one inside of Notion. And the third one, right, we saw previously already with the AI autofill, even though like the AI autofill is kind of happens automatically, right? Whenever something new happens, right, if you set up AI autofill, it will try to categorize this. It's still enough of a, manual action apparently for a Notion database automation to trigger. But the second that two Notion database automations try to trigger off each other, it won't work. I think we are ready for a challenge. And this is a really fun one. It's a little bit involved, but it's a really, really cool and useful use case, and will show you a ton of the principles that we just learned. So let's tackle this. As you know, I'm currently building Europe's #1 Notion consultancy, and we work mostly with startups, scale-ups on the one hand, and then asset managers like VC and private equity on the other hand. So if this is something that you might be interested in, definitely reach out to us and we see how we can help you. If that happens, right, and you become one of our clients, you might go through some onboarding tasks. And this is now a fictional list, right? Our actual onboarding is similar, but not exactly the same. And one thing that you might want in this situation, right, either in my case, right, for my clients, or if you have any system where you have recurring tasks and then a bigger project, like in this case, the client, right? And you want to automatically update the status of the project based on certain tasks being completed, right? Not like we did it previously, where we say, okay, when any task is in progress, we want to do something. No, here we want to make sure that if specific tasks have been completed, we want to set a specific status. That is possible, but again, a little bit involved. So what is our setup? Well, the very first thing that we need is in our task database, there's actually missing one thing, there's missing a status. But the crucial thing that we need for this is we need a certain identifier, right? This could be any type of identifier. You could actually use the name to identify it, but that can be quite annoying, particularly if people update the name. I would not recommend to do this. So I would recommend creating a separate property, in this case, for example, the order property, to indicate which task is which. That is step one. Step two then is to create a formula on clients. And this formula will help us figure out, okay, when which task is completed, what elements should be, what should be the status. So let's click on formula and let's write this formula, right? We can call this helper status. And for our development project, we always like to create these helper properties, indicate them with these brackets in the front, and then use the gear icon, right? So it's at one glance obvious that this is a backend property. You could also, for like production ones, right, with bigger teams, then set a property description so that everyone knows not to touch this. But for now, this is good. Then let's edit the formula. We first need to figure out which tasks are completed. So we do this by clicking onboarding tasks, right? And then say filter current.status should be done, right? This gives me now my two tasks which are done here. And then I don't care about the names, right? I care about the identifier. So in this case, I want to say then map current.order. Great. So now I can print out, right, which tasks have been currently completed. And this is now something that I need to save in a variable because we're going to reuse this expression over and over again, this formula. And remember from our previous lessons, this is when we want to use let's. So let's say let's, and then we do, let's call the variable name completed. Then we put on the next line our formula expression, and then we can then create whatever formula we want, right, to print this out, and this will then use our formula. There's currently an error here. Let's just see what the issue is with that. We're missing a comma here, and now we see it resolves properly. Quick recap, right, of our previous formula lessons. Now instead of completed, we're going to, of course, now use another formula here. And what we basically want to do is we want to check certain conditions. So we want to check whether, what the status should be. And we want to do this in reverse order. So basically, we want to look at our different statuses, and I just created a few sample ones here, right? So let's take audit. So we want to say, okay, when the audit step, when certain tasks have been completed, we want to have the status as audited. In this case, what I want to do is I want to say, okay, whenever we are at step, where's our audit step? Okay, workspace audit is number 3. Let's actually make this number 7 for now. And then let's turn the initial workspace setup to 3, right? That's, of course, the wrong order, but just for the gist of it, we want to say when task 7 has been completed, we always want to show workspace audit. All right, so how do we check this? Well, we say ifs, and we say, does completed include the number 7? Now, if that is the case, what do we want it to show? Well, we want it to show audit, right? And if that isn't the case, what do we want it to show? Well, we want to show it like, not started, right? Our standard default one, also as a string. And then we can simply close this all off, right, with another bracket. And now we see if our audit task is completed, number 7, then we get audit up here. And if I take, off here, the done progress off, right? If this is only in progress, we see it falls back to not started. Pretty good. Now we need to do this for every single step, right? So I will just do one other step just to show you. So let's say, right, initial discovery call. Okay, when number 1 is done, then we wanted to show what is it here called in conversations. So let's go back here and say, okay, after we checked for this condition, right? With ifs, we can check for a bunch of conditions. So after we check for this condition, we want to check does completed include number 1. And that's why we need to do it in reverse order, right? Because of course the last one, if the last one is true, all the previous steps will be true as well, and we'll never check the others. So the most complex condition needs to be first, and then we go in descending order. So in this case, we want to say in conversations. All right, and then still the fallback will be not started. So now you see, because 1 is done, we are in conversations here. And if I check back this, right, we go back to the order step. Perfect. Now, of course, you'll say, well, this is nice, but this is a string, right? It doesn't update the status. And yes, that is true, right? Notion formulas, as we learned previously, can never impact the value of a property. It can only show something. We need database automations to actually change this value. Luckily, we can do this, right, with our newfound knowledge. Now, counterintuitively, maybe at first, the automation actually doesn't run on projects. The automation that we need is on here, because currently one thing that you'll notice is missing from our automations is a trigger when a formula property changes, right? Here we don't see our formula values. So that's a current limitation, right? It might be different by the time that you see this video if you watch it in a few months. Maybe then we can trigger it off formula changes, and it's even easier, then you can do it here, and it would be as simple as, right, okay, when this property changes, do something. But until that happens, we need to actually trigger this automation on tasks. And what needs to happen, because here we have a trigger available, right? So it's called as set project status. And all we'd say is, okay, when the status of a task is set to completed, what I want you to do then is first I want you to define a variable, right? We need to grab our project, where you know the drill for this, right? It is trigger page dot our client, I think it's called here, right? My clients, perfect, save. And then what we want to do is we want to edit pages in clients. Should have named this client, not project, but you get the gist. And then we want to say edit a property. And we want to edit the status. And now for setting the status, we're going to use a custom formula. We're not going to hard code a value in, right? We could do this. You could write this formula instead to say, okay, when, you know, task with 1 is completed, when task with 2 is completed. But that, I'll show you that in a second, but it's like very, very cumbersome. And particularly if you have like 50 different conditions where you don't want to do that. So instead what we want to do is dynamically you want to say, set this to whatever. Let's move myself over here. The project dot first dot helper status property values, right? So just to recap, what are we doing? Project equals the project value of the related entry. And remember, like this is an array, even though it has only one entry. So in order to do something, get a specific value, we need to either use map or first. We will use here, since we only have one entry always. And then we can grab now a specific value from that. And that is this string output up there. And as long as this string update exactly matches one of our status options, it will actually update the status property accordingly. So let's click on save. Let's click on enable. Let's set this here back to not started. And currently, right, this is not started, right? It should actually be in conversation, but since we didn't do anything on done, it won't work. We can actually do the whole flow, right? So let's do this, right? It's currently not started. And now if I click here and set this to done, this updates to in conversation, and in a moment this should update as well if we actually have the exact matching name. I don't remember whether I wrote in conversations or in conversation, so we'll have to figure that out. Doesn't look like it's working yet, so let's check this. Yes, it says in conversations, so that's a great point for this, right? So we need to make sure this matches absolutely exactly, also in terms of spelling. And now if we repeat the process, we should be able to see the update in a moment. So let's click on done again, and then in a moment it will update this here, and then we have the proper status dynamically set based on the specific task. There you see it, it just happened. And then if I do the same, right, for our workspace audit, not started, done, same thing happens, right? This will now update it to audit. Now this is a really, really cool and powerful workflow that we use a lot with our clients. We actually usually have another layer here, right? Because these are recurring tasks, so they happen whenever a new client gets created. So what we typically do is like this triple setup, right? We have a database for the processes of the clients. And then we have an automation currently running in Make because it's something that doesn't work too well with Notion automations yet. And say whenever we add a new client, we add this whole list of process tasks automatically with the corresponding order to Notion, right? So whenever you add a new client or a new project, whatever new with a recurring process to your setup, you have all the tasks that belong to it. And then as you finish off these tasks, right, you automatically update the status accordingly so that everything always stays in sync without you having to manually do that. Pretty cool. Now, one quick note here, and that is if this task database, right, is not just onboarding tasks, but also general tasks, then you want to modify your automation slightly. Just because in a lot of situations, if there's no specific order number, you don't need to fire the automation, right? Here, the automation fires all the time. You can do that, right? It doesn't really impact anything, but just to reduce the load on Notion servers, what we can do is we can actually add a second trigger to this. If I click into it, you see that here for Notion database automations, we actually can set several triggers, and we can either say when all occur or when any occur, right? So either say all things together need to be true, or any of them could be true. So in this case, what we want to make sure is we say at the second trigger, we want to make sure that the order, right, is bigger than 0. And that means if there's no order number in it, right? It won't trigger the automation and won't try to update anything. Just like a little bit of a courtesy inclusion. Now for another workflow that is particularly useful for companies using Notion. And this is really, really cool because again, right, it ties in a bunch of Notion's recent features. Here we have a system to actually track requests, right? So fairly common in bigger companies, you will have a lot of processes that have to be followed. And one of these processes, or most of these processes are usually tied to someone making a request to someone else. This can be really templatized, right, as a sort of blueprint for requests. But let's take a specific look at here this combination of having tools in our company, right? And then people requesting access to them, right? So let's say, okay, in my company, I use Zapier, Make, Notion AI, Loom, and Miro, and I want to provide people access with licenses to that if they request so. What do? Well, first I will actually set up a form, right? My basic setup is two databases and they relate to each other. Now I set up a form. So I go quickly here, say, okay, form, request new database, request access. We can, add the name, the requester, if we wanted to, right? We can fill itself out. We can also make it just a created by property. That would probably make more sense, right? So I'm going to remove this here, delete the question, but we want to know who is the manager, the requester date, and then here the tool that they want to get access to. So let's make sure that, our actual property is, created by, that will be, our requestor property. Perfect. Now what happens, right? If someone fills it out, we want to run an automation. And we want to run an automation to notify the manager who will have to approve whether this person should get access to. So how do we do this? Well, we go here, say create a new automation, notify manager. And we say, okay, whenever a page is added, and adding something with a form counts as this, right? It's not an automated action, it's a manual action. Do the following. Send a notification to person property. It will be the manager. And we will say, okay, the trigger page dot requester just requested access to, and then we can go in, right, the tool that was requested, and then go, please go to your, manager dashboard to review and approve this request. And we can build them a dashboard, right, where they see all the requests of like people that they manage in one page, so they can easily do this. And then we click on enable. So far, so good, right? This is the very first step in our automation flow where someone goes in, they say, yes, okay, this person should have access, or no, this person should not have access to it. Now, when we have our request in here, right, there will be then at some point an action where the manager will approve this. And if that happens, we again want to trigger an automation with a few things happening. So let's go back to creating a new automation, right? We say new automation, notify about success. And we're going to say, okay, this should happen when the status of the request is set to, whatever the positive outcome is. In that case, what we want to do is we want to first send a notification, and we could either use Notion notification, right? We could also use email, right? If we wanted to, as a different action, we could use the Gmail one, although I don't have mine connected here right now, so I'll keep using the normal one, but you could also send an email, right, with that information, really cool. And we send this now to a person property again, right? In this case, it will be sent to the requester, and I will, good news, and then, the trigger page, the manager, just approved your request for trigger page tools, right? Amazing. Perfect. And then we could include additional information, right? We could link actually to a document, right? This is now where it gets really, really fun. You have access here, right, to just general add commands, right? So I could just say, look for like a certain page in my knowledge base where we maybe have instructions on how you actually get your license key or, your first steps in the tool. Really, really flexible here, what we can do then there. But that's the one step, right? We want to notify the requester. And the next action will be we need to update our tools database, right? Because here we need to now record that a new person is using this tool. So let's say, okay, we want to define variables. Our variable will be, the tool, and the value will be trigger page dot tools. And then our action here will be to say, okay, edit pages in tool. And here, what we want to do is where it's current users, right? We want to not replace it, but we want to add now a person. And the person that we want to add is not, a specific one, right? Not the person who triggered it, right? Because the person who triggered it in this case will be the manager. We have two options. Either we can take page creator because that's the one, right, who requested it, or we can again use a custom formula to access this value. We can say, okay, trigger page dot requester. That is what we want in there, and then we can enable. And now what will happen is the second we set this to done and delivered, I'll get a notification because I'm the manager and the requester. And then current users here will update in a moment with Matthias. Amazing. Which then means, of course, as you know, right, is we can create now a formula here and we can calculate our current tool costs, right? So current tool cost, if this is a license base, right, we could say, okay, give me current users dot length and multiply this with our cost per seed value. And then we can save this. We can say this should be actually, not a normal number, but it should be dollars. Now we can also formulate it differently. And now we have a live updating thing. Whenever, something gets approved, we see the cost. We could then, take it one step further and add now a chart here, right, to break down, okay, how much do we currently spend on our different tools? And that just beautifully ties in, a lot of Notion's recent feature releases, which is why I'm so excited about this as a specific workflow, right, for this, okay, let's map all our whole, request process with automations, rollups, and formulas. Now for a bit of a simpler use case, but still very useful, we can use Notion database automations also to do some automated cleanup work for us. Let's say, for example, right, we want to make sure that if tasks have due dates that are approaching, or maybe it's even overdue, and they don't have a responsible person, we make sure that someone is responsible for it, right? Like we never want to have a situation where a due date rolls around, but no one is supposed to do it. So how do we do this? Well, let's go to automations. Let's create a new automation, and let's say, okay, set responsible for overdue. And we can do this also like in general, right? We can say, okay, whenever something is overdue, right, the team lead needs to have a look at this. So trigger would be every day, right? And we can set a time, right? So let's set this to, every day around, 11:45 or something like that, whatever you prefer. Do this following action. Edit pages in, right? Again, careful with what your, filter is here. You don't want to like overwrite all the data. So we're going to say in tasks, please don't edit all tasks. Edit the ones where due date, right, is before today, so that gets all the ones that are in the past, and where the status is not completed, and where responsible is empty. If these conditions are true, then what I want you to do is I want you to go in, and I want you to set a certain person as responsible. I want you to make sure that you replace the current responsible with, Matthias, who now needs to take a look at this and make sure things work properly. Then we can enable this, and now every day, right, run this cleanup job. It could also be, to, set the status to in progress if you want to encourage that someone works on this now, right? It could also be, again, right, if you do weekly time blocking, you could say, okay, on Saturday, I just always run on Saturdays an automation that cleans out all the DO dates for open tasks, so I can refresh it, sort of what we had previously, right, with the button. Well, you can also run this automated on the clock. Now, one limitation to be aware of here, at least right now, might be different right by the time you watch this video, is that for these cron jobs, so for these scheduled automations, we don't have access to the individual values of an entry, right? It would be really cool if we could say, okay, based on basically go through every task, right, where this is true, and based on certain properties in this one, do certain things. For example, maybe we want to notify actually the person who's responsible, right? So let's say, okay, send notification to, and you see, oh, up to 20 people. Well, custom formula. Let's do this, right? Let's figure out who's responsible for this task, right? So to notify that person, to create alerts in Notion, but here, we don't have actually the page, right? We only have time triggered or date triggered, so there's no option to actually access currently the property values for this automation. Again, hopefully a change that comes soon, but at least right now, just to be aware of, right, if you're trying to build something cool with these daily automations, is you can do certain actions, like just, update things, but you can't do actions based on certain values in the page that gets edited. As promised, let's also look at the use case where we can use our Notion data to send custom Slack notifications. As I mentioned earlier, right, this one can't be done with Notion database automations alone, but they are a crucial building block, so I'm going to just sneak that in as a bonus into this video. What you want to do is you want to use the action of sending a webhook, and that's one we also haven't used in any automation yet, so it's a great example. Let's say, for example, we have our onboarding tasks here, right? And not just do we automatically update our status here, but we want to notify the team in Slack whenever one of these steps happen, right? So that we know, okay, this is the next thing, that's now on the line, and so on and so on. So let's just update here a few properties. Let's add, the responsible person, right? So let's add a person property, and let's say responsible. Perfect. Responsible. Amazing. And let's, add me here a few times for these tasks. Perfect. Now, what we want to do is whenever something gets done, right, we want to tell that, say that in Slack, and want to figure out, okay, what is the next thing that has to happen. In order to do so, let's click on here the automation and say new automation, and we want to say, okay, when notify Slack when the status is changed to done, then please send a webhook. And we could actually like add this as an additional step, right, to our other automation, because there's already like when it's set to done. But just to show you how it would look as a clean one, let's do it here. We want to send a webhook. Now, what is a webhook? A webhook is basically a way between to send information from Notion when something happens to another tool, which is very, very useful, because oftentimes, right, Notion database automations still won't allow us to do everything we want them to do. We need to integrate other tools, either for actions that we do then in Notion, where we have just some limitations, or when actions are supposed to happen in other tools, right? For example, in Slack, or pretty much anything else in your workspace, in your tech stack. So in order to do so, Notion will then, when something is true, send some information to a URL. And this URL is one that you then catch with your other tool, right? So for example, if in this case, we're going to use Make. Make.com is an automation platform similar to Zapier or Relay.app. You can build this workflow with all of them there, but I'm just going to show it to you with Make here for a change. Now, what we want to do is in Make, when we have a new scenario, we want to click on this big icon in the middle, right? That adds our first element, and we want to add the webhook element. If we say custom webhook, right? Let me zoom in here a little bit. We get the option to create a new hook. And so I'm going to click on add, right? And I'm going to call this my test webhook. And then I'm going to click on save. Now I get a URL, and this is the URL that I'm going to copy, right? I can click on save here, click on copy, and I go back here and I paste this in there. Now Notion, when this action happens, will send a notification to this address. We can test this once, right? We can click on enable, and we can go back here, right? And click on run once to test the whole thing. And then we can take any of our tasks, right? Say, okay, this has been completed. And then we can go back to make and wait for the data to come through. Zoom in a little bit more. And then in a moment, right, this will tell me that it got information from Notion. There it is. We got some information, and it will tell us, well, okay, this came from Notion. This is the, the event ID, and this is the data from the entry, right? For example, we get the URL here, and we get, who created it and so on. Pretty nice. Now, what we can also do with this webhook is we can tell Notion to send additional information with it, right? So as you see, when I go back to my automation, we have here certain properties that we can send with that, which is very useful because we have then access to that information in our make scenario. So let's send the name of the task, right? And let's say who was responsible for this, and maybe also the client. That also seems like a good idea. Then click on done, and then let's run the whole thing again. We can also right-click this to run this specific module, and let's set another task to done, and then we'll again wait for a moment for this to show up here. With the data here, we can then open this again, right? And in properties, we now see, okay, task, right? I have my title here, for example, solution design presentation, and I have the person who is responsible also here with their name. And then we can use that now to create our custom Slack notification, right? So, oops, that was a mistake. Let's click here to add another module. Let's pick Slack. Let's say, okay, create a message, and what I want you to, is I want to send this to a specific channel, right? So this can be, whatever Slack channel ID you have, you'll input here. And then for the text, we can now write our custom message. So we can say, okay, here from properties, I would like to, get the responsible person, right? People, name, Matthias, just completed tasks, and then grab here the solution design presentation. And then click on save, right? And now when we turn this on, right, down here, and clicking this button immediately as data arrives, we can save this whole thing. Whenever a new webhook gets fired now, we will get this custom Slack notification in our section. We have full control over the information that is sent, right? And the way the message looks like. We could add the URL to it. We could add additional steps here in this third-party automation tool, right? Where we could look up, okay, what is the next task in line? Which one has to be done now? And so on and so on. A bunch of additional things, which gives us a lot more granular control over the automation than Notion's built-in Slack notification. And this really is a general idea with webhooks, right? They allow you to trigger something in a different app based off your Notion information. And the really cool thing is that it's basically real time, right? There's sometimes a delay of a few seconds, but you can use it to trigger things pretty much instantaneously, whether that's, in this case, notifying someone on Slack, or it could be, in case you use Notion to write your social media post, to push that social media post into your actual platform where you schedule it. Or when, in Notion, you confirm that an order has been, has been fulfilled. It could update your, it could create an invoice in another system. Like, the world is really your oyster here. Webhooks are super, super useful. They basically always mean that the automation will finish running elsewhere, but still it gets triggered through Notion database automation, so we need to know about it. Let's wrap things up with a very important limitation of Notion database automation that currently still exists, right? And that sort of means there's still a ceiling to what we can do in Notion. And that is that Notion database automations don't have search. They don't have a dynamic option to query something. In Make, right, for example, you have a module with Notion that I could add here, add a module and say Notion and could call this like search objects, right? And what I can simply tell is, okay, please go into a certain workspace, and in this workspace, in this database, find all entries where I am the responsible person, right? Or where the due date is today. In Notion, that doesn't work. At least it doesn't work dynamically, right? We can, of course, go in and say, okay, new automation. And what we want to do is, right, we want to find all the entries that have condition X. But this condition X is hard-coded. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say we have here projects, right? And we want to make sure, maybe this is, like Matthias stack. And I want to make sure that ideally, when I click this button, I want all tasks in the task database that are assigned to me related to this project, right? There is not a relation existing already. I want to create this relation. That's something that we currently can't do, at least not dynamically. Because when we take, now a button, right? Let's add our button here and say, okay, what do I want this to do? I want, when I click this, I want to edit pages in, right? I want to go to a different database. I want to go to my task database. So far, so good. And now here in tasks, I want to find all tasks where the person who clicked the button is responsible. And this like dynamic part, right? Person who clicked the button, that's what we can't do. Because if I go now to edit all pages and I go to responsible, I see that I can select a person, but I can't write a formula here, right? In all these other steps, we have the option to write formulas to dynamically access data from our entry where, the action occurred to do this, but not when we build these filters. And that means that unlike with the other elements, right, where we say, okay, now for related entries, we can always update those. If that isn't the case, if there isn't a relation pre-existing, we can't do dynamic search. So that's one big limitation with Notion automation that you will run into a lot, right? Like we haven't covered any of the use cases where we would need that because, well, it's currently not possible. But as soon as Notion adds that, right, that's another layer that we have then in our tool repository to build really, really cool workflows. If that happens, right, I'll update this video or record another one. So make sure you also subscribe to the channel so you won't miss that. You're pretty much a Notion automations expert now, with one thing still missing, and that is, what do you do when something goes wrong? Well, until very recently, Notion database automations were actually kind of problematic because they didn't have any error handling at all. Now, the situation is still not great, but at least it's a little bit better. Basically, one issue is that if you have an automation running and something about this automation won't work, then, well, it will not run. And you then have to sort of troubleshoot what went wrong. So let's say, for example, right, we have here our automation and we say set tasks to in progress, right? When status is in progress, define custom variable and then edit our trigger, in tasks, different elements. Let's say we go now into tasks and we delete our status property, right? That's the thing that our other database, this automation, wants to update whenever we set something to in progress. So let's go, right, and let's set this back for a moment and then wait, and then we can put it back to in progress, and then we'll see how this error gets handled, right? So we click now on progress, and then in a moment, this automation is going to run, and it's going to, try to go into tasks and update this property, which doesn't exist anymore. So if we click on here, we see now, invalid. Something went wrong, right? Fix any errors or remove failing step to prevent this automation from pausing on failure. Let's click into it, right? And then we see if we scroll down now here, it tells me that this property was deleted, right? The thing that it's trying to update doesn't exist anymore. You also will get a notification here, right, as the person who created this automation that, this automation failed and you have to look at it. So there's a little bit of a heads up, but still it means that in particular, if you build automations in a team environment where a lot of people use the system and could mess something up, you need to establish a habit of regularly checking all your automations to make sure that they're still up to date. And unfortunately, that involves going into the individual databases or places where you create these buttons because there's not a central overview for Notion automations yet. Which is why it's so important to create proper documentation when you do this, right? So you know exactly, okay, what do we need to check and what are the relevant elements that we need to keep an eye on. Amazing. With that, now let's just touch on a little bit of, quality of life or good to know elements about automations, and those are the following. If you click on automations, right, on the database automations, and you look at any of them, right, one that is valid, right, and works, let's do it here. We see that we can click on the three dots to pause this automation, right? So if I just want to, temporarily disable it, I can do so here without having to delete it. And then I see here, okay, this automation has been paused. Quite useful. Another thing is that if you look at your automation right now, let's make this active again, and you have different views, you can actually change where this automation should run, right? Remember earlier, if I create a new automation, here it tells me all pages in project. So most of the time, that's what you want to go with, right? You want to have an automation for all entries somewhere. But sometimes you only want to run automations based on entries in certain views. So if that's the case, right, you're gonna make sure you go in here and say, okay, only trigger this for elements in this view, right? So if a page is filtered out here, if it doesn't pop up there, then the automation won't run. Another cool way to make your filters a bit more granular, right? Other than the triggers that you have available already there. All right, that's it for this Notion masterclass. If you still have any questions about formulas or automations, or a specific use case that you'd like to explore, well, let me know down below in the comments. And if you want to continue learning, I've got you covered. Here's a video with 117 must-know Notion tips in 2025. Just click here and I will see you in a second.